The wind whispered through the ancient oaks, their twisted branches reaching skyward as if pleading with the heavens for answers. Beneath their shadows, a figure moved silently, cloaked in the deep green of the forest, his presence both haunting and magnetic. He wasn't a king or a knight, yet his name carried through the whispers of villages, taverns, and even castle halls. Robin Hood. A name that danced on the tongues of the oppressed like a prayer and burned in the throats of the powerful like a curse. The truth behind the name was as elusive as the man himself. Was he a savior? A thief? A killer? Or something in between? For those who lived under the crushing weight of feudal rule, he was a shadow of hope, a symbol that maybe justice could still exist, even if it came in the form of arrows that struck silently in the dead of night. In the hollow silence of Sherwood Forest, tales of his deeds spread like wildfire. A nobleman's gold caravan found overturned and emptied. A sheriff humiliated, stripped of wealth meant to fund the chains that held the poor in servitude. The laughter of the merry men echoing in the distance, almost ghostly, as they faded into the woods. But with every whispered story of stolen riches, there were murmurs of darker truths. Some said Robin's hands weren't merely stained with the dirt of the forest, but with the blood of those who dared to stand against him. Guards who refused to yield to his demands, travelers who crossed his path unknowingly, all said to have met the sharp end of his arrows. Yet the same voices that whispered these accusations would quickly falter, questioning their own words. Could the same man who gave bread to starving children also spill blood without mercy? He was no saint. That much was certain. His story was never meant to be one of purity. It was one of survival. In a land where the law was written by those who sat behind stone walls and feasted on the labor of others, Robin Hood became a law unto himself. Those who feared him said he was a demon dressed in green. Those who loved him called him a hero born of necessity. But for the villagers whose lives he touched, the details mattered little. They spoke of a man who appeared when the tax collectors came with their lists and their demands, when the sheriff's men dragged fathers from homes and left mothers sobbing in the dirt. They spoke of how the oppressors would leave empty-handed, their pride shattered, their authority mocked. To them, Robin Hood was more than a man. He was a phantom, an idea that couldn't be caught or killed. He became a rallying cry, a figure who reminded them that the powerful were not untouchable. Even if they never saw him, even if they only heard the stories, the mere thought of him gave them courage. But what did Robin feel in those moments when the forest grew silent and the weight of what he had done settled upon him? Did he find solace in the laughter of his men as they shared stolen wine around the fire? Or did the faces of those he had wronged haunt him in the dark hours, their eyes staring back at him from the depths of his memories? Perhaps the forest was both his refuge and his prison. A place where the trees bore witness to his triumphs and his sins. A place where he could hide, but never truly escape. Sherwood wasn't merely a backdrop to his tale, it was his sanctuary, his battlefield, and his cage. Yet the legend grew, weaving its way into the hearts of the oppressed and the nightmares of the privileged. For every village spared by his defiance, another sheriff sought vengeance. For every coin returned to a starving family, a bounty on his head grew larger. Some said he fought for love, others for revenge, and still others for a cause greater than himself. But the truth? It lay buried in the depths of the forest, where the trees whispered secrets that no man could fully understand. And so, the name Robin Hood echoed through time, carrying with it the weight of the hopes and fears of a fractured land. The man behind the name, however, remained shrouded in mystery, his story twisting and turning like the winding paths of Sherwood Forest itself. But for those who dared to follow the echoes of his name, the path led not just to tales of heroism but to shadows far darker than they ever imagined. Beyond the next bend in the forest, the whispers grew louder, mingling with the laughter of unseen voices. They beckoned, their tone both enticing and foreboding, promising that the legend of Robin Hood was far from over. The air in medieval England was thick with tension, the kind that clung to every cobblestone street and crept into the creaking walls of drafty manor houses. The sky was often gray, a reflection of the lives lived under its expanse. For the common folk, The days blurred into one another, marked by toil, hunger, and the ever-looming shadow of the ruling class. It was a time of kings and lords, of knights adorned in polished armor, their deeds sung by bards and courts dripping with wealth. But beneath this gilded facade lay a nation deeply fractured, where the scales of power were tipped so heavily toward the few that the many were crushed beneath their weight. It was here, in the dirt and despair of the common people, that the legend of Robin Hood found fertile ground. The Kingdom of England in the 12th century was a land of contrasts. Castles rose like iron fists from the earth, their stone walls both a symbol of protection and oppression. Inside, the wealthy dined on roasted meats and fine wine, their halls lit by flickering torches and their laughter echoing against high ceilings. Outside, peasants trudged through muddy fields, their bodies bent under the strain of plowing land they would never own. For the peasantry, life was a constant struggle. They paid taxes in silver they didn't have and in grain they could scarcely spare. The king's sheriffs collected these dues with a cold efficiency, their hands outstretched not just for payment but for compliance. Resistance wasn't an option, it was treason. The feudal system ruled every aspect of life. Lords controlled vast estates, with their serfs tied to the land like livestock. The church, with its sprawling cathedrals and promises of salvation, demanded its own tithe, ensuring that even the spiritual life came at a price. Injustice wasn't an anomaly, it was the backbone of society. The forests, though, offered a sliver of hope. Vast, sprawling, and untamed, places like Sherwood and Barnesdale became sanctuaries, not just for outlaws, but for those fleeing the unbearable weight of their lives. Within the cover of the ancient trees, whispers of rebellion began to stir. It was an era defined by a brutal hierarchy. The king ruled as a near-divine figure, his will enforced by barons, knights, and an intricate system of laws designed to protect the interests of the elite. The common folk were pawns, their fate sealed by the whims of those above them. Yet, despite this, there was a current of resistance, a slow-burning anger that simmered just beneath the surface. Crusades drained the kingdom of its men and its resources, leaving families fractured and villages vulnerable. Meanwhile, the returning knights brought stories of foreign lands, wealth, and glory that seemed to mock the struggles of those left behind. Taxes soared to fund wars that most Englishmen never understood, let alone supported. The church's influence was both a blessing and a curse. Its sermons preached humility and obedience, promising rewards in the afterlife while turning a blind eye to the suffering of the present. For every kind-hearted priest who offered solace, there was a corrupt bishop pocketing alms meant for the poor. Amid this, the legend of Robin Hood began to take shape. It wasn't just a tale of a man stealing from the rich to give to the poor, it was a cry for justice in a world that had forgotten its meaning. Robin became the voice of the silenced, a figure who dared to challenge the unchallengeable. Medieval England, with all its grandeur and misery, created the perfect storm for such a figure to emerge. The very laws that sought to control the land birthed a defiance that would haunt the powerful. The forests, dark and forbidding, became the stage for a drama that would echo through centuries. Beneath the weight of history, the air seemed to hum with a promise of rebellion, of retribution, of a name that would not be silenced. Robin Hood wasn't born in the castles or the courts, he was born in the mud and shadows, forged by the struggles of a land that longed for a champion. And so, as the lords dined and the peasants labored, as the forests whispered and the sheriffs schemed, a legend began to stir. Somewhere, in the heart of England's pain, the seeds of something extraordinary were taking root. The stage was set, the players unknowingly in their places, and the shadows of the forest waited to embrace their most famous outlaw. It began not with the clash of swords or the flight of arrows, but with whispers carried by the wind. Whispers of a man who stood against the tide of oppression, whose name sparked both fear and hope. The origins of Robin Hood's legend are as tangled as the dense forests he is said to have roamed, a mosaic of truths, half-truths, and outright fabrications pieced together over centuries. In the earliest tales, Robin Hood wasn't a nobleman. He wasn't a dispossessed earl or a betrayed knight. He was a yeoman, neither lord nor serf, but a freeman, a man of the land. His name, some said, wasn't even Robin Hood. The record spoke of Robin Hood, Habahad, or sometimes simply the Hood, as if the man had merged with the shadowy emblem of his defiance. The first written mentions of Robin Hood didn't appear in books or royal proclamations. They were fragments, scrawled in the margins of legal records, names of men outlawed for refusing to bow to the king's law. A Robert Hood in Yorkshire, another in Nottinghamshire, mere ghosts on parchment, their stories left untold but their defiance immortalized in a single damning word, outlaw. What drove these men to the fringes of society? The answer was as old as humanity itself, survival. Feudal England offered little mercy to those who faltered. A missed harvest, a wrong word to a powerful man, or an accusation of theft could strip a family of everything. For many, the choice was stark: live as a hunted outlaw or die as a forgotten victim. Robin Hood's legend grew from these margins, from the desperation of those who had no voice. The earliest ballads tell of a man who lived outside the law but upheld a code of his own. He stole from the rich, not out of greed but necessity, and he gave to the poor, not for glory but justice. He wasn't a savior, he was a thief. But he was their thief. The forest became his sanctuary, a place of exile and freedom. In the ballads, Sherwood was more than a setting, it was a character in its own right. Its ancient oaks and hidden glades shielded Robin and his band from the law, while its vastness reminded all who entered that no king could truly tame the wild. But there was more to his story than defiance. As the years passed, the legend absorbed elements of chivalry and romance, painting Robin as a nobleman wronged by the crown, fighting not just for survival but for honor. The tales of Robin Hood began to shift, reflecting the hopes and fears of those who told them. Some said he was a Saxon, a rebel against the Norman conquerors who had divided England between the privileged and the powerless. Others claimed he was a soldier, returned from the Crusades to find his homeland corrupted and his birthright stolen. Still, others insisted he was a mere invention, a symbol of resistance rather than a man of flesh and blood. The truth is unknowable, buried beneath centuries of myth and reinterpretation. But what mattered to the people of medieval England wasn't whether Robin Hood had truly lived. What mattered was what he represented. To the oppressed, he was a champion. To the powerful, a menace. To history, a question mark. Even his band of followers, Little John, Friar Tuck, Will Scarlet, and Maid Marian, carried their own air of mystery. Were they comrades in arms or creations of later storytellers? Did Marian, in her defiance of societal norms, embody the longing for freedom shared by countless women trapped by the strictures of the age? Or was she merely a romantic embellishment, added to soften the edges of an outlaw's tale? The origins of Robin Hood's legend are as murky as the waters of the River Trent that snakes through Nottinghamshire. Each telling adds a layer, a twist, a new perspective. But one thread runs through them all: rebellion. Against injustice, against authority, against the crushing weight of a world that cared little for the lives it ruled. As the tale spread from village to village, carried by wandering minstrels and whispered in darkened taverns, Robin Hood became something larger than a man. He became an idea, a reminder that even in the darkest times, defiance could burn bright. But in the shadows of Sherwood, the trees held their secrets close. Perhaps somewhere within their ancient embrace, the truth of Robin Hood still lingers, waiting to be uncovered, or perhaps the man and the myth were always one and the same. The Norman conquest was not just an event, it was a transformation, a tidal wave that swept across England, leaving its people and landscapes forever altered. In the year 1066, when William the Conqueror's forces triumphed at the Battle of Hastings, the world of the Anglo-Saxons began to unravel. What followed was not merely a change of rulers, but an upheaval that dug deep into the soul of the land and its people. The Normans came with their banners high and their swords sharp, but their most enduring legacy wasn't written on the battlefield, it was inscribed in the fabric of everyday life. For the Anglo-Saxon peasants, who had worked their fields under the loose yoke of local lords, the Normans' arrival was like a storm tearing through a fragile home. The conquest carved England into parcels of power, handed out like spoils of war to Norman nobles loyal to William. Lands that had belonged to Anglo-Saxon thanes were stripped from them without ceremony. Whole villages changed hands, their inhabitants reduced to mere tenants, tied to the soil they had once called their own. The Doomsday Book of 1086, that great ledger of Norman ambition, bore witness to the scale of this upheaval. It catalogued not just wealth but also loss, a chilling inventory of a land brought to heel. The book spoke of entire regions laid waste, their fields barren and their people scattered. For the common folk, the Normans were more than conquerors, they were foreign overlords who spoke a language they couldn't understand and enforced laws they couldn't escape. The traditional rights of free men were trampled beneath the weight of feudalism, a system that demanded unquestioning loyalty and ceaseless labor. Castles sprouted across the land like jagged teeth, not as symbols of protection but as instruments of control. These fortresses, with their high walls and moats, were stark reminders that the people who had once roamed freely were now subjects of a distant king. Each castle cast a long shadow, both literal and figurative, over the surrounding countryside. The Norman conquest also brought with it a new set of laws, harsh and unyielding. The infamous forest laws, for instance, turned vast tracts of England's woodlands into royal preserves. What had once been common land, where villagers hunted and gathered firewood, was now off limits. The penalty for poaching was severe, often death. In these forests, the seeds of rebellion began to take root. Stripped of their rights, forced to toil for foreign masters, and punished for daring to survive, the Anglo-Saxon people found themselves pushed to the brink. The forests became not just places of refuge, but also crucibles for resistance. It is here that the legend of Robin Hood begins to intersect with history. The figure of the outlaw, hiding in the shadows of Sherwood Forest, might never have existed without the backdrop of Norman rule. The conquest had created the conditions for his myth to thrive, a world where justice was a rare commodity and defiance was the only recourse for the oppressed. But the Normans' influence wasn't solely brutal. They brought with them new ideas and systems, reshaping England in ways both visible and invisible. Their architecture, cathedrals that soared toward the heavens and castles that loomed like mountains, forever altered the landscape. Their governance centralized power in ways that would lay the foundation for a future kingdom, even as it crushed the liberties of those living under it. The language of the conquerors, Norman French, seeped into the tongue of the conquered, creating the English we recognize today. This blending of cultures, though born from conflict, would become one of the enduring legacies of the conquest. Yet for those living through it, this was little comfort. The Norman conquest was a fracture in time, a line drawn sharply between what was and what would be. For the peasants laboring under heavier burdens, for the disinherited nobility mourning their lost lands, and for the outlaws lurking in the woods, it was a catastrophe. And yet, in the shadow of this upheaval, something unyielding began to stir, a defiance that would not be extinguished by kings or castles. It whispered through the forests and echoed in the ballads sung around flickering fires. A name began to emerge, whispered at first, then spoken with pride. The Norman conquest might have changed England, but it could not silence the spirit of rebellion. The seeds of legend had been sown. The outlaw was not born from rebellion alone. He was forged by necessity, by the cruel realities of a world where the law offered little mercy and even less justice. In medieval England, to be an outlaw was to exist on the edges of society, stripped of protection, condemned to a life of peril and uncertainty. Yet, in this grim existence, the outlaw became more than a criminal, he became a symbol. The label of outlaw was not reserved for hardened thieves or murderers. It could fall upon anyone who failed to answer the summons of the court or pay their dues. A missed rent, a quarrel with a powerful lord, or even being in the wrong place at the wrong time could result in exile from the law's protection. To be outlawed was to be declared fair game, anyone could harm or kill you without fear of reprisal. This was not a punishment taken lightly. For the common man, outlawry meant severing ties with everything familiar, family, home, and the fragile networks of trust that held medieval communities together. It meant retreating into the wilderness, where survival was a daily battle against hunger, cold, and the ever-present threat of capture. Forests like Sherwood and Barnesdale became sanctuaries for outlaws, their dense canopies offering shelter and secrecy. These were no idyllic havens, but harsh and unforgiving landscapes. To live as an outlaw was to become one with the shadows, to move with the silent precision of prey constantly hunted. Yet, in these dark corners of the world, a strange kind of freedom could be found. Stripped of societal constraints, the outlaw existed outside the feudal order, answering to no king, no lord, no law. It was this defiance, this refusal to bow to a system designed to crush the powerless, that captured the imagination of those who remained within its grasp. Among the outlaws, camaraderie was not just a choice but a necessity. Bands of outlaws often formed, bound by mutual need and a shared disdain for the authorities that had cast them out. These groups were not merely gangs of criminals, they were communities, each member playing a role in their collective survival. The stories of such bands, of loyalty and betrayal, triumph and tragedy, became the stuff of legends. Songs and ballads celebrated their exploits, painting them as heroes who stole not out of greed but out of necessity, who gave not for glory but for justice. These tales were told with a knowing wink, an acknowledgement of the fine line between truth and embellishment. But not all outlaws fit the romantic mold of Robin Hood and his merry men. Many were as brutal as the world that had rejected them. Some turned to banditry, preying on the weak and vulnerable in a cruel reflection of the system they had fled. Others became pawns of powerful lords, hired as enforcers or spies in their masters' private wars. The line between outlaw and hero was often blurred, shaped as much by who told the story as by the deeds themselves. To the ruling class, outlaws were a menace, a threat to the fragile order that kept their power intact. To the oppressed, they were a flicker of hope, a reminder that even in the darkest times, rebellion was possible. In the ballads of Robin Hood, the outlaw emerges as a figure of moral ambiguity, a thief, yes, but a thief with principles. He robs from the rich not for personal gain, but to redress the balance of a world tilted against the poor. He defies the sheriff and the law not out of spite, but because the law itself has become a weapon of the oppressors. This image of the outlaw as a noble rebel resonated deeply with the people of medieval England. It gave voice to their frustrations, their dreams of justice in a world where justice was scarce. In the outlaw, they saw both their plight and their potential, a reflection of what they endured and what they longed to become. Yet, the reality of outlawry was rarely so idealistic. For most who bore the title, life was a constant struggle, a precarious balance between survival and capture. The gallows loomed large over their existence, a grim reminder of the price of defiance. Even so, the allure of the outlaw persisted. It was not just the deeds of men like Robin Hood that ensured their legends endured, it was what those deeds represented. In a world of harsh divides, between rich and poor, lord and serf, law and justice, the outlaw was a bridge, a figure who could stand against the tide and, for a moment, hold it back. And so, in the forests and fields of medieval England, the outlaws lived and fought, their lives weaving a tapestry of defiance and despair, hope and hardship. They were hunted and hated, celebrated and sung about. There were shadows in the night, whispers in the wind, and symbols of a rebellion that could not be extinguished. The name Sherwood Forest stirs images of towering oaks, whispering leaves, and shadows that dance with intrigue. For centuries, it has been immortalized as the home of Robin Hood and his band of merry men, a place where justice flourished in the face of tyranny. But beneath the romance lies the question, how much of Sherwood Forest is rooted in reality, and how much is the product of storytelling? In medieval times, Sherwood Forest was not the mythical expanse of boundless greenery that ballads often describe. It was a royal forest, a legal designation rather than a pure geographic one, stretching across parts of Nottinghamshire. These forests were not solely composed of trees, they encompassed open fields, heaths, and even villages. What defined them was their status as land reserved for royal hunting, governed by the harsh forest laws that strictly controlled who could hunt, gather wood, or even live there. Sherwood's landscape was far from the serene paradise often depicted. It was a rugged and wild place, dotted with ancient oaks like the famous Major Oak, a tree said to have sheltered Robin Hood himself. These trees, with their gnarled branches and hollow trunks, stood as silent witnesses to centuries of history, their very presence lending credence to the legends. But Sherwood Forest was also a contested space, where the forest laws created tensions between the crown and the common people. For the villagers and farmers who lived on its edges, these laws were a source of frustration and fear. A single misstep, poaching a deer or cutting down a tree, could lead to severe punishment, from heavy fines to execution. This oppressive system fostered resentment, making Sherwood a breeding ground for stories of rebellion and resistance. It is in this historical context that Sherwood's reputation as a refuge for outlaws took shape. The forest, with its dense canopies and winding paths, offered natural concealment for those fleeing the law. Its terrain, difficult to navigate for outsiders, became an ally for those who knew its secrets. Robin Hood's association with Sherwood Forest, however, is a more complex tale. The earliest ballads, dating back to the 14th and 15th centuries, make only fleeting references to specific locations. Some of these point to Barnesdale, in Yorkshire, as the legendary outlaw's stomping grounds rather than Sherwood. It wasn't until later that Sherwood became firmly linked to Robin Hood, thanks to writers who sought to ground the legend in a real, tangible place. Why Sherwood? Perhaps it was the forest's already notorious reputation as a haven for outlaws. Or perhaps it was its proximity to Nottingham, whose infamous sheriff became Robin Hood's enduring adversary. Whatever the reason, Sherwood Forest emerged as the symbolic heart of the legend, a place where the outlaw's defiance against authority could take root. Over the centuries, Sherwood Forest itself has changed. The sprawling expanse of medieval times has diminished, with much of the land cleared for agriculture or lost to development. Today, only a fraction of the original forest remains, preserved as a reminder of its storied past. The major oak still stands, its ancient limbs propped up like an aging warrior, a living connection to a time when the forest was more than just a place, it was an idea. Yet, even as the physical forest has shrunk, its mythological presence has grown. Sherwood Forest is no longer just a location on a map, it is a symbol of freedom, resistance, and the enduring power of stories. Whether or not Robin Hood and his merry men truly roamed its woods, Sherwood remains inseparable from their tale. For those who visit today, the forest offers glimpses of its storied past. Walking among the ancient oaks, it is easy to imagine shadows flickering between the trees, the faint echo of laughter or the twang of a bowstring. But beyond the romance lies the reality of Sherwood Forest, a place shaped by history, scarred by conflict, and forever etched into the cultural memory of England. The truth of Sherwood Forest is that it is both fact and fiction. Its trees and paths are real, rooted in the soil of Nottinghamshire. Its legends, however, have taken on a life of their own, transcending the bounds of history. Whether as a refuge for outlaws, a battleground for justice, or simply a symbol of what could be, Sherwood Forest remains a place where reality and myth intertwine, inseparable and eternal. The Sheriff of Nottingham looms large as a figure of menace and authority in the legend of Robin Hood. To some, he is a ruthless enforcer of laws that serve the rich and powerful. To others, he is a complex symbol of medieval justice and tyranny. In every retelling of the tale, the sheriff stands as Robin Hood's unyielding adversary, a man whose power and ambition cast a long shadow over the people of Nottinghamshire. In medieval England, sheriffs were not mere local officials, they were agents of the king, entrusted with maintaining law and order, collecting taxes, and enforcing royal decrees. Their jurisdiction extended over shires, hence the title Shire Reeve, and they wielded significant authority. The Sheriff of Nottingham would have overseen a vast territory, dealing with everything from disputes among villagers to the execution of the king's justice. But with great power often came great corruption. Sheriffs had opportunities to abuse their position, skimming from tax collections, demanding bribes, or turning a blind eye to the actions of the wealthy while crushing the poor under the weight of their authority. In a system where survival often depended on connections and wealth, the sheriff could be both judge and executioner, his decisions shaping the lives of those under his control. This historical reality made the Sheriff of Nottingham the perfect villain for the Robin Hood legend. As an embodiment of corrupt authority, he became the foil to Robin's outlaw heroism. In the ballads, he is portrayed as cunning, relentless, and utterly ruthless, a man who stops at nothing to capture the rogue who dares to defy him. But what would it have been like to face the sheriff in real life? For the villagers and townsfolk of Nottinghamshire, he was not just a character in a story but a living, breathing force to be reckoned with. His word could mean life or death, prosperity or ruin. The sheriff's men patrolled the forests and villages, enforcing the harsh forest laws, confiscating lands, and punishing poachers with brutal efficiency. The tension between the sheriff and the common people was palpable. The law, in theory, was meant to provide order, but in practice, it often served the interests of the crown and the nobility. The Sheriff of Nottingham, as the king's enforcer, became the face of this inequality. To the oppressed, he was not a protector but a predator, a symbol of everything they despised about the feudal system. In the Robin Hood tales, the sheriff is depicted as relentless in his pursuit of the outlaw, obsessed with restoring his authority and bringing the renegade to justice. Yet, Robin's cleverness and resourcefulness consistently outwit him. From daring rescues to elaborate traps, Robin turns the sheriff's own schemes against him, making him a figure of both fear and ridicule. The sheriff's role in the legend is more than just that of a villain. He represents the broader struggles of medieval society, the conflict between the powerful and the powerless, the tension between justice and law, and the yearning for fairness in an unjust world. His character serves as a reminder that those who hold power are often the ones who face the greatest scrutiny, their actions shaping the stories told about them for generations. Yet, the Sheriff of Nottingham was not entirely a figure of fiction. Historical records suggest that sheriffs like him did exist, their actions documented in court rolls and royal decrees. These men were not necessarily evil but products of a system that valued loyalty to the crown above compassion for the people. They operated in a world where survival often depended on the ability to wield power ruthlessly, where mercy was a luxury few could afford. The sheriff's legacy is one of complexity. He is not simply a villain to be defeated but a reflection of the harsh realities of medieval life. Through him, the Robin Hood legend captures the essence of resistance against tyranny, the fight for justice in an unjust world. And though his name has become synonymous with oppression, the Sheriff of Nottingham remains a figure that challenges us to consider the true nature of authority and the cost of power. In the shadow of Sherwood Forest, the sheriff's presence lingers, a reminder of a time when the line between hero and villain was as blurred as the paths through the trees. And as Robin Hood's eternal adversary, he ensures that the legend remains not just a story of rebellion but a tale of the complexities of human nature. The air was thick with the scent of sweat and soil as farmers bent their backs to the earth, coaxing life from the unforgiving ground. They labored not for themselves, but for their lords, who watched from grand halls built on the toil of others. This was feudal England, a world divided by rigid hierarchies, where power was inherited and rebellion was a dangerous whisper in the wind. The feudal system, with its strict chain of command, ensured that wealth and privilege flowed upward, leaving those at the bottom struggling to survive. Lords owned vast estates, while peasants worked the land in exchange for protection that often felt more like submission. Taxes, rents, and tithes drained what little they had, leaving their families teetering on the brink of starvation. Any act of defiance risked severe punishment, whether through imprisonment, mutilation, or death. For the common folk, hope was a fragile thing. The church, the one institution that claimed to represent the poor, often aligned with the powerful. Priests preached obedience as a virtue, urging the oppressed to accept their suffering as God's will. Yet, even the promise of heaven felt hollow when their children cried from hunger and their hands were calloused from endless labor. It was from this cauldron of injustice that rebellion began to simmer. Small acts of defiance, stealing grain, refusing to pay taxes, or harboring fugitives, spread like sparks in dry timber. Sherwood Forest, with its dense trees and hidden paths, became a refuge for those who could no longer bear the yoke of oppression. Here, men and women banded together, driven not just by desperation but by a shared belief that something better was possible. The legends of Robin Hood grew from these seeds of rebellion. He was not merely a thief, but a symbol of hope, a figure who dared to challenge the lords and sheriffs who bled the people dry. To those who heard the stories by firelight, Robin was one of them, an outlaw who struck where they could not, taking from the rich to give to the poor. He became the embodiment of their anger and their dreams, a living defiance against a system that seemed invincible. The rise of rebellion was not without cost. For every Robin Hood who eluded capture, there were countless others who were hunted down and made examples of. Villages suspected of harboring outlaws faced brutal reprisals, homes were burned, crops destroyed, and entire families left destitute. Yet, these acts of violence only deepened the resentment. The more the powerful tried to tighten their grip, the more people slipped through their fingers. Even within the walls of manorial estates and castles, cracks began to form. Some lords, burdened by debts or swayed by conscience, began to question the system that enriched them at such a high cost. Others, fearing the growing unrest, tightened their control, their paranoia creating even greater divisions. The tension was palpable, a thread pulled taut between two worlds, each unwilling to yield. Rebellion, when it came, was not always grand or organized. It often began with whispers, secret meetings in the dead of night, and plans scrawled on scraps of parchment. But when the oppressed rose, their fury was like a storm, chaotic, unrelenting, and impossible to ignore. They tore down symbols of authority, from tax records to the walls of prisons, reclaiming what had been taken from them. The story of Robin Hood captures this spirit of rebellion in its purest form. It speaks to the yearning for justice, the hunger for equality, and the belief that even the most entrenched systems can be challenged. Through him, the voices of the downtrodden found a champion, their struggles immortalized in tales that outlived kings and kingdoms. But rebellion was not just about destruction, it was about the possibility of something new. The forests that sheltered outlaws also became sanctuaries for ideas, a place where people could dream of a world without chains. They shared stories of what could be, finding strength in their unity and purpose in their struggle. Feudal oppression was a force that shaped lives and defined destinies, but it could not extinguish the human spirit. In the face of cruelty, there was resistance. In the face of injustice, there was hope. And in the depths of Sherwood Forest, where the trees whispered secrets of old, rebellion took root, growing into a legend that would endure for generations to come. The weight of taxation in medieval England bore down like an unrelenting yoke, tightening with each passing season. For the peasantry, it wasn't just a question of fairness, it was a matter of survival. Each coin demanded was a measure of their sweat, their toil, and often, their despair. The promise of protection from lords and kings came at a steep price, and the reality of taxation revealed a system more interested in sustaining its own opulence than in safeguarding the lives of those who kept it afloat. The demands came in many forms. The king levied taxes to fund wars, bolster defenses, and maintain his court. The church demanded tithes, proclaiming it was for the salvation of souls. Local lords added their own burdens, rents, fees for using mills, and fines for infractions as minor as gathering wood from the forest without permission. The peasants' harvests, already at the mercy of unpredictable weather and meager soil, were often divided into fractions that left little for their families to eat. These weren't mere inconveniences, they were life and death struggles. A bad harvest meant starvation, and a missed payment could mean imprisonment, the loss of land, or worse. Families watched as what little they had was carted away, their children's hungry cries echoing in empty cottages. The cruelty of the system wasn't just its greed but its indifference. It didn't care who went hungry so long as the coffers were full. Taxation was enforced with brutal efficiency. The sheriff of Nottingham and his men became symbols of this oppression, ensuring that every debt was paid and every law obeyed. Their methods were ruthless, confiscating livestock, seizing property, and meting out punishments that served as grim warnings to others. The people lived in fear of the knock at the door, knowing it could strip away what little remained of their lives. This relentless oppression sowed the seeds of rebellion. Stories of Robin Hood took root in the hearts of those who yearned for justice. The outlaw who defied the tax collectors, who stole from the rich and gave to the poor, wasn't just a hero, he was a vision of revenge against a system that had bled them dry. In these tales, Robin's actions weren't crimes, but acts of defiance, striking at the heart of a system that had stolen their dignity. Yet, the real face of taxation wasn't just about coins and crops, it was about control. By keeping the peasantry in a constant state of poverty and dependence, the lords and kings ensured that rebellion could never gain a foothold. Hunger sapped their strength, and fear silenced their voices. The system thrived on their misery, perpetuating a cycle that seemed unbreakable. But cracks began to appear. The rebellion wasn't just in the stories of outlaws, but in the quiet resistance of everyday people. Some refused to pay, risking the wrath of their overlords. Others hid their goods, smuggling grain and livestock to avoid confiscation. And in the hidden corners of Sherwood Forest, where the trees stood as silent witnesses, a different kind of resistance took shape. Robin Hood's legend became more than a tale of theft and bravery. It was a cry for justice, a demand for change. It reflected the anger of those who had suffered too long and the hope of those who believed in a better world. Through his actions, the outlaw exposed the hypocrisy of the system, revealing that the real crime wasn't in stealing to feed the hungry but in hoarding wealth while others starved. The true cost of taxation in medieval England was measured not just in gold but in lives and spirits broken under its weight. It was a system designed to enrich the few at the expense of the many, enforced by fear and sustained by desperation. And yet, even in its darkest moments, the human spirit refused to be extinguished. The face of taxation, cold and unyielding, stood as a symbol of everything wrong with feudal society. But the defiance it inspired, the courage to resist, the determination to fight back, became the foundation of a story that would endure for centuries. In the legend of Robin Hood, the people found not just a hero but a reflection of their own struggles, their own hope, and their own fight for justice. The line between banditry and heroism is as thin as the blade of a dagger, and often it is perception, not action, that defines a person's legacy. For Robin Hood and his band of outlaws, this line was blurred in the shadows of Sherwood Forest, where the cries of the desperate met the laughter of the defiant. To the law, Robin Hood was nothing more than a thief, a cunning bandit who evaded capture, mocked authority, and sowed chaos. The sheriff of Nottingham saw him as a menace, a man whose actions challenged the stability of the realm. The nobles whispered of his audacity, their hands clutching their treasures tighter with every new tale of his exploits. For them, Robin was a threat, a man who dared to disrupt the hierarchy that placed them at the top. But to the peasants, Robin Hood was a savior. He didn't just steal gold, he stole back dignity, returning to the people what had been stripped from them by a merciless system. Each act of defiance, each sack of coin distributed among the hungry, became a spark of hope. In a world where the rich grew richer on the backs of the poor, Robin stood as a symbol of resistance, a hero who had the courage to do what they could not. Still, the truth was far more complex. Robin and his band of outlaws lived by their own code, one that didn't always align with the moral ideals of heroism. They were skilled fighters, cunning strategists, and relentless in their pursuit of justice as they saw it. Yet they were also opportunists, taking advantage of their knowledge of the forests and the weakness of their enemies. Not every theft was a noble act, and not every victim was a villain. The duality of Robin's character, bandit and hero, mirrored the complexities of his time. In a society where the law served the interests of the elite, breaking that law wasn't always a crime in the eyes of the oppressed. To take from the rich was not just an act of theft, but a form of justice, a balancing of scales weighted too heavily in favor of the powerful. The stories of Robin Hood blurred these distinctions further. In one tale, he ambushes a wealthy caravan, sparing the guards but taking their riches. In another, he rescues a widow and her children from eviction, using stolen gold to pay her debts. These actions weren't just rebellion, they were redemptive, reshaping the narrative of crime into one of heroism. But not everyone in the forest shared Robin's ideals. Banditry in medieval England was rampant, and not all outlaws were champions of the poor. Many were ruthless thieves, preying on anyone who crossed their path, driven by desperation or greed. These were the bandits who gave rise to the fear of the forest, a place of lawlessness and danger where the weak stood little chance. What set Robin apart wasn't just his skill or bravery but his purpose. His actions, though illegal, carried a sense of justice that resonated deeply with those who suffered under feudal oppression. He became more than a man, he became a legend, his name a rallying cry for those who dared to dream of a fairer world. Yet, the legend also masked the grittier reality of life in the forest. For Robin and his band, survival was a daily struggle. Food was scarce, winters were harsh, and the constant threat of betrayal or capture loomed over them. They weren't immune to the temptations of power or the moral compromises that came with their way of life. Even the noblest intentions could be tainted by the necessity of survival. The tension between banditry and heroism remains a powerful thread in the Robin Hood story. It forces us to question the nature of justice and the role of law. Are heroes defined by their adherence to the rules, or by their willingness to break them for the greater good? Is it enough to act with good intentions, or do the consequences of those actions hold greater weight? Robin Hood's legacy lies in this ambiguity. He was a bandit who became a hero, a lawbreaker who stood for justice, a man who straddled two worlds and left his mark on both. His story reminds us that the lines we draw between good and evil, crime and heroism, are not always as clear as they seem. Sometimes, it is in the gray spaces between that true heroism is found. The towering spires of medieval cathedrals symbolized the power of the church, casting long shadows over the lives of the people below. To the common folk, the church was a place of solace, a sanctuary where they sought guidance, forgiveness, and hope. But beneath its hallowed walls, a darker truth festered, a truth that corrupted its holy mission and turned faith into a weapon of control. In the time of Robin Hood, the church was not just a spiritual institution but a political and economic powerhouse. It owned vast lands, rivaling the wealthiest lords, and its leaders wielded influence that extended into the courts of kings. Monasteries thrived as centers of learning and culture, but they also served as repositories of unimaginable wealth. Gold chalices glittered on altars, and storerooms overflowed with grain, even as the peasants who worked the land went hungry. Tithes, mandatory payments of a tenth of one's income, were the church's lifeblood. Every villager, no matter how poor, was expected to contribute. Refusal or inability to pay was seen as defiance, not just against the institution but against God himself. For many, these payments were a crushing burden, stripping them of the little they had left after paying taxes to the crown and their feudal lords. The church's insistence on these dues was unwavering, even during times of famine or plague. But it wasn't just wealth that corrupted the church, it was the human failings of those who wore its robes. Bishops and abbots, meant to embody humility and virtue, often lived lives of excess. Feast halls echoed with laughter as tables groaned under the weight of delicacies, their opulence mocking the starving masses outside. Clergy, meant to guide the faithful, instead indulged in sin, their moral authority eroded by scandals whispered in darkened corners. The selling of indulgences, a practice where sins could be absolved for a price, was perhaps the most glaring symbol of corruption. The wealthy could buy their way to heaven, while the poor were left to bear the weight of their transgressions. Salvation, once the promise of divine grace, became a commodity, auctioned to the highest bidder. This corruption did not go unnoticed. Among the oppressed, the church's grandeur and greed became a source of resentment. The very institution that was supposed to protect the weak seemed to have aligned itself with the oppressors. Its wealth mirrored that of the nobles, its leaders often more interested in power than piety. Robin Hood's rebellion wasn't just against the crown or the lords, it was also against the corruption within the church. Many tales recount his defiance of the clergy, robbing fat bishops traveling in gilded carriages, redistributing their wealth to the poor. These stories didn't merely entertain, they reflected the growing discontent of a population disillusioned with those who claimed to speak for God but acted in their own interests. Yet, not all within the church were complicit. There were monks and priests who truly lived by their vows of poverty, dedicating their lives to helping the sick, the poor, and the downtrodden. Figures like Friar Tuck, one of Robin Hood's trusted allies, embodied this paradox. A man of faith who rejected the institution's corruption, Tuck joined the fight for justice, proving that the church's ideals could still inspire heroism. For the common people, the church's corruption was both a betrayal and a tragedy. Faith was their anchor in a world of uncertainty, and to see that faith twisted into a tool of exploitation left scars that ran deep. Yet, it also fueled a yearning for change, for a return to the purity of belief untainted by greed and ambition. In the dark woods of Sherwood, where outlaws gathered to challenge the forces that oppressed them, the church's shadow loomed large. It was a reminder of the complex web of power that bound them, a web woven not just by kings and lords, but by those who claimed to serve the divine. Robin Hood's defiance of the church wasn't a rejection of faith, but a stand against its misuse. In his story, the people saw a challenge to the status quo, a hope that even the mightiest institutions could be held accountable. It was a bold declaration that justice and compassion, not wealth or titles, were the true measures of righteousness. The greenwood, vast and untamed, loomed as both sanctuary and symbol. Its dense canopy, alive with the rustling whispers of leaves and the soft light filtering through branches, was a world apart from the oppression of the villages and manors. For Robin Hood and his band of outlaws, it was not just a hiding place, but a lifeline, a space where rebellion could breathe. The forest carried an air of mystery, its depths filled with the promise of freedom and the threat of danger. To the peasants, it was a land of hope, where the iron grip of the Sheriff of Nottingham and the relentless demands of the lords could not reach. Here, the rules of feudal society lost their weight, and a different kind of justice prevailed. But the greenwood was not merely a backdrop. It held a deeper meaning that resonated with all who heard Robin Hood's tales. To those shackled by the injustices of medieval life, it symbolized defiance. It was the one place where the hunted could become the hunter, where the powerless could find strength in unity. Life in the greenwood was far from idyllic. The forest was wild, unpredictable, and often unforgiving. Food was scarce, gathered from the land or taken during daring raids. Winter brought bitter cold, and the outlaws had only their wits and camaraderie to sustain them. The forest might have been a refuge, but it demanded resilience. It tested their resolve, forging bonds that would be their greatest weapon. Yet for all its hardships, the greenwood was alive with its own magic. Its rivers and streams provided water, and its dense underbrush offered concealment. The towering oaks and elms, some older than memory itself, seemed to stand as silent witnesses to the struggles and triumphs of those who dared to make it their home. The forest's rhythms became theirs, its sounds and silences shaping their days and nights. For Robin Hood, the greenwood was more than a sanctuary, it was a declaration. Each step beneath its boughs was an act of defiance against the lords who claimed dominion over every inch of land. To live there was to reject the authority of those who would see the common folk bent under the weight of taxes and labor. In the forest, the outlaws carved out their own form of society, one built on principles of equality, loyalty, and shared purpose. The greenwood also served as a powerful symbol in the stories told about Robin Hood. Its vastness mirrored the boundless hope of the oppressed, while its hidden paths and secret clearings reflected the cleverness and resourcefulness of the outlaws. It became a character in its own right, as integral to the legend as Robin himself. But the greenwood's reality was as complex as its symbolism. To the authorities, it was a threat, a place where lawlessness reigned. They feared its darkness, not just for what it hid, but for what it represented, a challenge to their control. The Sheriff of Nottingham and his men pursued Robin and his followers through its tangled paths, their fear of what the greenwood allowed, the freedom to fight back, ever present. To the peasants, the forest was a paradox. It was a place of refuge, but also of danger. Stories of wolves, bandits, and spirits that haunted its shadows were as real to them as the hope it represented. Yet, these fears were often overshadowed by the tales of Robin Hood, who transformed the greenwood into a beacon of resistance. The greenwood was both reality and legend. It was a place where the outlaws struggled and thrived, but also a symbol of a world that could be different. It whispered to those who dared to listen, telling them that the structures of power were not immutable, that there was a place, hidden, untamed, where they could be free. Through the centuries, the greenwood has remained a timeless metaphor. It speaks of resilience, of carving sanctuary in a world that seems unyielding. For Robin Hood, it was not just where his story unfolded, but where his legend was rooted, a place where freedom grew wild and justice was a part of the land itself. She was more than a shadow behind a man. Maid Marian stood as a force of her own, a symbol of grace and strength in a world ruled by swords and laws designed by men. Her beauty was undeniable, but it was her spirit, a mix of defiance, compassion, and sharp wit, that etched her into the hearts of those who heard the tales of Robin Hood. She was not merely a lover or a companion, she was a partner in rebellion, an equal who challenged the norms of her time. Marian moved through two worlds with ease, the glittering halls of nobility and the untamed wilds of the greenwood. Within the courts, she donned the guise of a proper lady, her poise and eloquence masking a soul that burned with quiet rebellion. She saw the feasts where the lords and clergy gorged themselves while the peasants starved. She heard the laughter of power, laced with cruelty, and it fueled her desire for justice. When she stepped into the greenwood, she shed the trappings of aristocracy and embraced the freedom it offered. Here, titles and wealth held no value. Her worth was measured in her courage, her cunning, and her unwavering commitment to the cause. She was as much a part of the resistance as Robin himself, wielding her influence and skills to aid the outlaw band. Marian was no damsel waiting to be rescued. She was a fighter, in her own way. While Robin might wield his bow, Marian used her intelligence, her charm, and her knowledge of the nobility's inner workings. She gathered information, sowed discord, and turned the weapons of the powerful against them. Her actions were as calculated as they were bold, and her contributions often tipped the balance in moments of crisis. But her story was not without sacrifice. To stand with Robin, Marian had to turn her back on the comforts of her birthright. The silks and jewels of her station were traded for the rough fabrics of life in the forest. The safety of her father's manor gave way to the ever-present danger of being hunted as an outlaw. She chose love and justice over privilege, and this choice set her apart from the passive heroines of other tales. Her relationship with Robin was one of mutual respect. They argued as much as they laughed, challenging each other in ways that made them stronger. Robin admired her resolve, her cleverness, and her ability to see through the facade of power. Marian, in turn, loved his unshakable sense of justice and his unwillingness to bend, even when the odds were stacked against him. Together, they were a force that inspired those around them, a partnership that symbolized what could be achieved when equals fought side by side. Yet, Marian's life was not free from vulnerability. The world she lived in did not look kindly upon women who defied its expectations. To the nobility, she was a traitor, a lady who had turned her back on her own kind. To the Sheriff of Nottingham, she was both a prize and a threat, someone to capture, to manipulate, to destroy if necessary. The risks she faced were immense, but they only deepened her resolve. In moments of quiet, when the stars pierced through the canopy of the greenwood, Marian revealed another side of herself. She was not untouched by fear or doubt. The weight of their rebellion, the danger they constantly faced, and the lives lost in the struggle often haunted her. But these moments of vulnerability only made her stronger. They reminded her of what was at stake and why she had chosen this path. Marian's presence in the legend also carried a deeper significance. She represented the voice of the people who were often silenced, the women, the forgotten, the marginalized. She showed that rebellion was not just the domain of men with swords, but also of those who fought with their minds, their hearts, and their unshakable belief in a better world. The greenwood came alive in her presence, its wildness echoing her own untamed spirit. She was the feminine element that balanced Robin's raw energy, grounding him when his fury threatened to consume him and inspiring him when hope seemed lost. In her, the people saw a different kind of heroism, one that was as fierce as it was compassionate, as strategic as it was brave. Maid Marian was more than a figure in Robin Hood's legend, she was its heartbeat. Through her, the story found its humanity, its depth, and its soul. Her actions, her choices, and her unwavering belief in the cause made her a heroine in her own right, a figure who stood not behind Robin Hood, but beside him, in the fight for justice. The Merry Men were more than just a band of outlaws, they were a family forged in defiance, a brotherhood bound by a shared purpose. Each of them carried a story of their own, tales of loss, betrayal, and survival in a world that sought to crush the common man. Together, they became symbols of resilience and hope, their unity a quiet rebellion against the fractured, oppressive society they had escaped. They came from different walks of life, each man bringing his strengths and flaws to the group. Little John, with his towering frame and unyielding loyalty, stood as a pillar of strength. He wasn't just a fighter, he was the steady hand, the voice of reason in the chaos of outlaw life. His bond with Robin Hood was unshakable, built on mutual respect rather than mere hierarchy. Little John's laughter could lighten the heaviest of hearts, but his fury in battle was something even the sheriff's men learned to fear. Friar Tuck was the soul of the group, a paradox wrapped in flesh. A man of the cloth, he often struggled with the duality of his role as both a spiritual guide and a rebel. Tuck's faith was not in the corrupt institutions of the church, but in the justice they fought for and the people they sought to protect. He could pray with the same intensity with which he swung his staff, his conviction unbroken by the hypocrisy he had left behind. His love for food and drink, often the subject of teasing, was a reminder that even in the darkest of times, joy could still be found. Then there was Will Scarlet, sharp-tongued and quick-witted. Where Robin's leadership inspired loyalty, Will's fire sparked action. He carried a deep bitterness, a wound from a world that had wronged him. Yet, his passion was not destructive, it was channeled into the cause. His keen mind made him a strategist, his daring nature a catalyst for some of their boldest raids. Will represented the unbridled rage of the oppressed, tempered by the bonds of brotherhood that kept him grounded. Much the same could be said for Alan-a-Dale, the minstrel whose songs carried their tales beyond the borders of the forest. His lute was as powerful as any sword, weaving melodies that inspired courage and captured the spirit of their rebellion. Alan reminded them all of the world they fought for, the laughter of children, the beauty of a sunrise, the power of love. His music turned their pain into purpose, their fear into strength. But their brotherhood was not idyllic. The merry men argued as often as they laughed, their differences creating tensions that sometimes flared into conflict. In those moments, Robin Hood's leadership was tested. He understood that their strength lay not in their individual abilities, but in their unity. His ability to mediate, to remind them of their shared cause, kept the group from fracturing. The Greenwood was both their sanctuary and their proving ground. It demanded cooperation for survival, and this necessity transformed the merry men into more than a band of thieves. They became a microcosm of what they hoped the world could be, a place where people were judged by their character rather than their birthright, where loyalty and kindness outweighed wealth and power. To the outside world, the merry men were a paradox. They were labeled outlaws, yet their actions painted them as heroes. They stole, but only from those who had more than they needed, and they gave to those who had nothing. Their raids were swift and calculated, often leaving the rich humiliated and the poor empowered. The Sheriff of Nottingham saw them as a threat, not just to his coffers, but to the very fabric of the feudal order. What made their bond unbreakable was the trust they placed in one another. In a time when betrayal was as common as the wind, they chose to believe in the strength of their brotherhood. Each raid, each narrow escape, each night spent around the fire strengthened their ties. They knew that without each other, they were nothing but scattered souls. Together, they were a force that even the might of the sheriff's men struggled to contend with. Their camaraderie was not without purpose. It was a declaration that the world could be different, that there was power in unity and rebellion in kindness. Each man's story added to the legend, their collective spirit turning them into something larger than life. The merry men were not just Robin Hood's followers, they were a reflection of the ideals he fought for, equality, justice, and the unyielding belief in the power of the people. Through their actions, the merry men became allegories of the brotherhood that humanity longs for. They showed that even in the harshest of times, when the world seemed devoid of hope, people could come together and create something greater than themselves. Their brotherhood was not just a means of survival, it was a beacon, a reminder that even in the darkest of forests, there could be light. The sound of a taut bowstring releasing, the whistle of an arrow slicing through the air, and the sharp thud as it met its mark, these were not just moments of skill, they were acts of defiance. Archery, in the legend of Robin Hood, was more than a craft or a weapon. It was a symbol, a quiet rebellion against oppression, and a beacon of hope for the downtrodden. Every arrow loosed from Robin's bow carried a message that freedom could not be silenced, and the spirit of resistance was as sharp and unyielding as the tip of an arrow. Robin's mastery of the bow was unparalleled, not just in its precision but in the grace with which he wielded it. It wasn't merely a tool of war, it was an extension of himself, as natural as the breath he drew. In his hands, the bow became a symbol of the common man's strength, a reminder that even those without land or title could challenge the mighty. The sight of Robin nocking an arrow, his gaze steady, his stance unshaken, struck fear into the hearts of his enemies and filled his allies with awe. Archery had always been a part of English life, a skill honed by peasants and soldiers alike. Yet, under Norman rule, it took on a different meaning. The bow, once a tool for survival and sport, became an instrument of resistance. The forests, claimed by the crown and turned into hunting preserves for the elite, were filled with deer that could feed starving families. To take one of these creatures with an arrow was to risk execution, yet many did it anyway. Each act of poaching was an assertion of their right to live, a quiet refusal to bow to the unjust laws of the feudal system. Robin Hood's bow embodied this defiance. It was not gold-encrusted or ornately carved, as the weapons of the nobility often were. It was simple, sturdy, and unyielding, much like the man who wielded it. And with it, Robin did more than hunt game or defend himself. He challenged the idea that power rested solely in the hands of the wealthy and the noble. Every arrow that flew from his bow reminded the people that justice could be reclaimed, that the tools of their oppression could be turned against their oppressors. The greenwood was Robin's sanctuary, and within its shadowed embrace, the bow became more than a weapon, it became a unifying force. The merry men practiced their craft with discipline, each arrow honing their skill and their resolve. Archery contests were as much about camaraderie as they were about skill, a way to strengthen the bonds between them and remind each other of their shared purpose. Robin's legendary feats with the bow were more than stories of skill, they were moments of rebellion turned into folklore. There was the tale of the splitting arrow, where Robin, in a contest meant to expose and capture him, shot his arrow so precisely that it cleaved another in two. The crowd erupted in cheers, their awe transforming a simple contest into a declaration that no force could suppress the will of the people. For the Sheriff of Nottingham and the nobles he served, Robin's bow was a source of constant dread. It was an equalizer, a reminder that no amount of armor or authority could protect them from the righteous hand of justice. Robin didn't strike indiscriminately, his arrows found the cruel, the corrupt, and those who hoarded wealth while others starved. But the bow's symbolism wasn't limited to justice alone, it was a symbol of freedom. The curve of the bow mirrored the arc of possibility, the string taut with potential energy waiting to be released. The arrow's flight through the air was like the dream of a better world, swift and unrelenting. Each strike was a step closer to a world where people could live without fear of oppression. In the hands of the merry men, archery became a way of life, a ritual that reminded them of their cause. The forest rang with the sounds of practice, the whispers of leaves merging with the hum of bowstrings. Each man knew that his skill with a bow could mean the difference between life and death, not just for himself, but for those who depended on their protection. Even in moments of quiet, when the battle ceased and the fires crackled in the stillness of the greenwood, the bow was never far from reach. Robin would often sit, his fingers tracing the familiar wood, his thoughts lost in the flickering shadows. It was a constant companion, a reminder of what they were fighting for and what they had yet to achieve. For the people who heard his tale, the image of Robin Hood with his bow was a spark of inspiration. It showed them that power was not solely the domain of kings and lords, but something that could rest in the hands of anyone brave enough to claim it. It told them that no matter how dire their circumstances, there was always a way to resist. The bow, in its simplicity, carried the weight of dreams and the promise of change. And in every arrow Robin released, there was a piece of himself, a man who refused to be broken, whose spirit soared as high and true as the arrow's flight. The Crusades had cast a shadow over medieval Europe, their echoes stretching far and wide, even into the deep forests of England where Robin Hood's legend took root. It was a time of upheaval, of kingdoms clashing in the name of religion, of knights donning armor for holy wars, and of empires rising and falling. But as the Christian armies marched to the east, far from the battlefields of Jerusalem, a different kind of war was taking place back home, one of power, land, and control. And in the heart of this turbulence, the story of Robin Hood was born. The Crusades, in their quest to reclaim the Holy Land from Muslim rule, drained the resources of the English crown. Kings and nobles, already swelled with power, demanded more from their people to fund the campaigns. Taxes were raised, lands were seized, and common folk found themselves further squeezed by the ever-tightening grip of feudalism. England's soldiers, many of them peasants, were called upon to fight in the Crusades, leaving their families vulnerable, their homes unprotected. For many, the return from the Holy Land was bittersweet, their hearts filled with the weight of loss and their pockets emptied by the king's demands. It was against this backdrop of desperation and resentment that the figure of Robin Hood emerged. While the Crusades raged in distant lands, the common folk of England struggled to survive under the oppressive rule of the nobility. Robin, a man of humble origins, saw firsthand the injustices inflicted upon the people in the name of power, wealth, and the glory of kings. He understood that while the Crusades were fought in the name of faith, it was the ordinary man who paid the price. The legend of Robin Hood, therefore, was not just a tale of outlawry, it was a quiet rebellion against a world that had been torn apart by crusades and wars. The Robin Hood who stood as a champion of the poor and a thorn in the side of the sheriff was also a figure who symbolized the frustration of a people whose sacrifices were often forgotten, their hardships dismissed. In the face of an unyielding, feudal system that sent men to fight distant wars while they starved at home, Robin became a hero who defied the very structure that the Crusades had only strengthened. At the same time, the Crusades themselves had left an indelible mark on the people of England. The Crusaders who returned were often embittered, changed by the brutal realities of war and the lives they had seen lost in foreign lands. Some were drawn to the ideals of knighthood, while others returned with a different kind of fire, the fire of disillusionment, of questioning the purpose behind the endless wars. For these men, Robin's cause was more than just a fight for justice, it was a challenge to the established order. It was a way to seek redemption in the face of a corrupt system, a system that had sent them off to fight, only to leave them destitute and broken upon their return. But Robin Hood's fight wasn't just a rejection of the Crusades. It was, in many ways, a critique of the way religion had been weaponized for political gain. The Crusades, though fueled by a noble cause, to reclaim Jerusalem, had been tainted by the ambitions of kings, the greed of the powerful, and the manipulation of the church. Robin, a man of the people, understood that the struggles of the poor had nothing to do with the glory sought by the monarchs who waged these wars. His arrows, his defiance, were a rejection of the false notion that the wealthy were closer to God, that their wars were more righteous, that their suffering somehow justified the suffering of the many. As Robin Hood's story spread, it became not just a legend, but a critique of the very fabric of society, a society that, like the Crusades, was built on the backs of the poor, fueled by the ambitions of kings and nobles who cared little for the lives of those they trampled underfoot. The contrast between the Crusaders, who returned to their lands laden with riches and titles, and the outlaws, who fought for survival and justice, could not have been starker. The Crusades, with their zeal and bloodshed, had shown how easily religion could be twisted to justify atrocities. Robin Hood, in contrast, showed that true justice could not be bought with gold or titles. It could only be earned by standing with those who had nothing, by fighting for the voiceless and the oppressed. It was a lesson that transcended the political and religious motives of the time, a lesson that even in the darkest of times, there could be light. So, as the Crusades raged on in the East, Robin Hood's legend flourished in the forests of England, a symbol of resistance against a world that had forgotten the true meaning of justice. His arrows, swift and sure, became the weapons not just of an outlaw, but of an entire people who had been left to bear the weight of a war they never asked for. The power of a story can shape the course of history. It can stir hearts, rally crowds, and change minds. In medieval England, amidst the fog of political unrest and the tightening grip of the nobility, the tale of Robin Hood became more than just a folk story, it became a tool of political propaganda, wielded by those in power and those seeking to dismantle it. And at the heart of this tale was a message that transcended the boundaries of fiction. It was a declaration of the people's power, a call to arms against tyranny, and a reminder that even the smallest voice could be heard. For those in power, the story of Robin Hood was a cautionary tale, a warning to those who would dare challenge the established order. The legend, with its outlaw hero defying the sheriff and stealing from the rich, could easily be twisted into a story about the dangers of rebellion. The authorities saw Robin Hood not just as a common thief, but as a symbol of anarchy, a figure who represented the collapse of social order and the potential for widespread disorder. Monarchs and nobles, ever fearful of uprisings, could use the story of Robin Hood to remind the peasants of their place. The idea that an outlaw, no matter how skilled or charismatic, could rise to prominence and challenge the might of the crown was a threat to the established hierarchy. To those in power, Robin Hood was not a hero, he was a menace. His defiance symbolized everything they feared: the erosion of their control, the rejection of their authority, and the spark of rebellion that could ignite across the country. By framing him as a criminal, a mere rogue, the elites sought to discredit the very notion of resistance and keep the common people in line. Yet, for the oppressed and downtrodden, the same tale was a breath of fresh air, a ray of hope. To them, Robin Hood wasn't a criminal, but a hero, a man who stood up for those who had no voice, who fought back against the oppression of the rich and powerful. In a society where the law was often used to serve the interests of the elite, Robin's outlaw status became a badge of honor. His story resonated deeply with those who had been left behind, those whose lives were dictated by the whims of kings and lords. His defiance against the sheriff and the nobility spoke to the heart of every person who had ever been mistreated, every farmer whose land was taxed into poverty, every man or woman who had suffered at the hands of an unjust ruler. Robin Hood became the figure they needed, someone who fought for them, someone who took a stand where they were powerless to do so. The political implications of the Robin Hood legend were clear. It was a challenge to the very foundation of feudal society. While the nobles and clergy used their wealth and influence to craft narratives that served their interests, the story of Robin Hood provided an alternative version of events, a version in which the poor and the oppressed had the right to fight back. It was a subtle form of propaganda, but one that could not be ignored. It painted a picture of a society where the peasants were not faceless drones, but people capable of heroism, capable of standing up against the injustices they faced. It's important to understand that the Robin Hood legend wasn't just an accident of folk storytelling. It was a carefully crafted narrative, molded and shaped to fit the needs of the time. It was a propaganda tool in its own right, and its message was not always about rejecting authority entirely, but about reclaiming power from those who had abused it. Robin Hood's rebellion wasn't about anarchy for the sake of anarchy. It was about balance, about fairness, about taking back what had been unjustly taken. For those in power, this message was dangerous. For the common people, it was revolutionary. The fact that Robin Hood's story has endured for centuries speaks to its potency as a political message. Over time, as England's political landscape shifted, so too did the way people interpreted the story. In times of upheaval, Robin Hood was a symbol of the people's struggle for justice. In more stable times, his legend morphed into a more heroic figure, someone who worked within the system rather than against it. The flexibility of his image made him an adaptable tool for political agendas of all stripes, ensuring that his legacy would never fade. Whether used by the nobility to maintain control, or embraced by the poor as a rallying cry for justice, the political power of the Robin Hood legend cannot be overstated. It shows us how a story, a simple tale of an outlaw and his merry band, can transcend its humble beginnings and become a force of political change. Robin Hood's arrows didn't just strike the hearts of his enemies, they struck at the heart of a society that had long believed its hierarchy to be unassailable. And in doing so, they gave voice to those who had been silenced, and a promise that even the smallest of revolutions could start with a single shot. The legend of Robin Hood, for all its origins steeped in the medieval past, found new life and a fresh identity during the Tudor era, a time when England was undergoing profound transformation. This revival wasn't just about the retelling of an old story, it was a conscious and strategic reshaping of Robin Hood's image to serve the needs and desires of a new generation under the rule of the Tudors, and particularly under the reign of Queen Elizabeth I. The Tudor period was one marked by religious strife, political instability, and the growth of a new national identity. The Tudors, having come to power after the tumultuous War of the Roses, were determined to stabilize the country and restore order. Under Henry VIII and later his daughter Elizabeth, the monarchy sought to assert its power, rebuild a fractured society, and redefine England's place in the world. But this was also a time when old ideas were being challenged, and when a new national consciousness was rising. People were hungry for heroes, figures who could embody the values of the new era: defiance against tyranny, the protection of the common man, and the restoration of justice. Robin Hood, who had once been the rogue outlaw challenging the corrupt establishment, was reimagined as a hero who fought for the people, not only against local authorities but also against the larger, more distant powers. His story became more than just an outlaw's tale. It was recast as a symbol of resistance against the very forces that had held England in thrall for so long. In this context, Robin Hood was no longer simply a man stealing from the rich and giving to the poor. He became the champion of national values, loyalty, courage, and the defense of the oppressed against unjust rulers, whether they were local sheriffs or foreign invaders. This Tudor revival of Robin Hood reflected a cultural shift in how the common people viewed their rulers. The growing tensions between the monarchy and the masses, particularly during the latter half of the 16th century, found resonance in Robin Hood's myth. As the monarchy centralized its power and the nobility grew ever wealthier at the expense of the peasants, many began to see Robin Hood not as a mere criminal but as an early advocate for social justice, a precursor to the political challenges of the later centuries. Queen Elizabeth I, for all her strength and determination, ruled over a time when the country was rife with social unrest. The Protestant Reformation, which had split England from the Catholic Church, had led to increased tensions between different factions of society. The poor, many of whom felt disconnected from the religious and political shifts occurring at the top, sought figures who could give them hope, figures who stood up against the powers that seemed to care little for their lives. During Elizabeth's reign, stories of Robin Hood were reintroduced to the public, especially in plays and pageants. Robin's image was molded to fit the political climate of the time. He was now a hero fighting for the rights of the common people, a defender of the people against both the corrupt nobility and the distant monarchy. His image was now one that aligned with the values of Tudor England, a fight for national unity, social justice, and personal honor. This reimagining of Robin Hood was also an attempt to create a national hero who could unite the country, especially in the face of external threats. Elizabeth's England was constantly under siege, by the Catholic Church, by Spain, and by other European powers. Robin Hood, in this new telling, became a figure not just of rebellion, but of national pride. His fight for justice was now a fight for England's soul. This made him more than just a figure of resistance. He became a symbol of England's identity as a sovereign nation, standing against both internal and external threats. The legend's revival in the Tudor era coincided with the rise of a more complex, nationalistic identity. The story of Robin Hood was adapted to reflect the growing sense of English pride. As the legend spread across the country, it evolved into a form of political commentary. Robin Hood's defiance was no longer just an act of personal rebellion. It was a challenge to the entire feudal system, one that aligned with Tudor ideals of national unity and centralized power. The outlaw became, in a sense, a precursor to the English nationalism that would later manifest in the works of Shakespeare and other writers. The Tudor reimagining of Robin Hood also signaled a shift in how the people viewed authority. In earlier renditions of the story, Robin was primarily a figure fighting against a corrupt sheriff, someone who was local and familiar. But in the Tudor version, his enemies were often larger, more symbolic figures: the nobility, the monarchy, even the church. This transformation reflected the political realities of the time. The monarchy and its allies were consolidating power, while the lower classes were feeling the weight of this consolidation. For the Tudors, the revival of Robin Hood was a way to assert control over a powerful and persistent folk hero, turning him into a tool for political cohesion rather than dissent. The Tudors, who had come to power through a combination of force and strategic marriages, understood the power of storytelling. They knew that the stories people told themselves about the past could shape the future. By placing Robin Hood within the context of the Tudor vision of a unified, strong England, they effectively neutralized the threat that Robin represented. He was no longer an outlaw challenging the monarchy, but a hero who fought to protect England from internal chaos and foreign invaders. The Robin Hood of the Tudor era, while still an outlaw, was now a symbol of the monarchy's power. He was no longer the embodiment of rebellion, but rather a defender of justice in a time of great change. His legend, revived and reshaped, became a tool for the Tudors to consolidate their rule, unify the nation, and, ultimately, strengthen their hold over the kingdom. The Tudors, ever aware of the importance of story in shaping history, turned Robin Hood into a hero for their age, giving new life to an old legend. By the time the Victorian era dawned, Robin Hood had transformed once again. No longer a mere folk hero or political symbol, he had evolved into something far greater, a romantic ideal embodying the desires and dreams of a new age. The mid-19th century saw the rise of Victorian Romanticism, an intellectual and artistic movement that glorified nature, individualism, and the untamed, heroic spirit of the past. And it was in this era, full of sweeping social change, industrialization, and rigid class systems, that Robin Hood found his most enduring incarnation. In the heart of Victorian England, amid the vast societal shifts of the time, people longed for a simpler, purer world, a world that was more in tune with nature, free from the corruption of the industrial machine. As the cities grew, so did the distance between the working class and the countryside, between people and nature. The Victorian upper classes were obsessed with recreating an idyllic past, one that reflected values of chivalry, honor, and the virtues of the natural world. In this context, Robin Hood's return to Sherwood Forest was not just a return to a physical place, but to a mythical, idealized past. Robin Hood, in the Victorian imagination, became a symbol of freedom and rebellion against a society that seemed increasingly more focused on material gain than on morality or justice. His band of merry men, once seen as mere outlaws or rebels, were now viewed as champions of the people, quasi-knightly figures who fought against the oppressive forces of the time. They were seen as protectors of the poor, the oppressed, the ones who had no voice in the rapid expansion of cities and the emergence of capitalism. The Victorian version of Robin Hood spoke to the rise of individualism in the wake of industrialization. He was the embodiment of personal integrity, courage, and, most importantly, self-reliance. In the 19th century, with the advent of the Industrial Revolution and the rigid class structures of Victorian society, Robin Hood became a figure of defiance against the system. His stealing from the rich to give to the poor took on deeper, almost philosophical meaning in this new context. It wasn't just about redistribution of wealth, it was about moral justice in a world that had become increasingly greedy, cold, and mechanized. In the world of Victorian Romanticism, Robin Hood's connection to nature was emphasized more than ever. His forest hideout, Sherwood, became a sanctuary, a natural refuge from the encroaching world of industry. The woods were portrayed as a timeless space, unspoiled by the Industrial Revolution, where Robin and his merry men could live freely, disconnected from the corruption of urban life. The forest, in many ways, was seen as a place of purity and authenticity, a stark contrast to the rigid, often suffocating structures of society that were becoming entrenched in Victorian England. The forest represented a lost Eden, a retreat from the pressures of modernity, and Robin Hood was its wild, noble guardian. The Victorian era, with its fascination for the medieval past, also infused the Robin Hood legend with an added layer of chivalric ideals. The concept of knighthood, honor, courage, loyalty, became central to the retelling of Robin Hood's story. Robin was no longer just a common outlaw, he was now a kind of noble hero, an anti-establishment knight whose only allegiance was to a higher, more universal justice. This notion resonated with a time when many felt that the new social order was failing to live up to its own ideals. Robin Hood's defiance against the sheriff and the nobility, in this version, was not just criminal rebellion but a battle for chivalric honor and moral righteousness. This romanticized version of Robin Hood was further romanticized in literature and the arts. Writers such as Sir Walter Scott and later, Howard Pyle, took the legend and painted it with the hues of nostalgia and honor. Their portrayals of Robin as a noble outlaw, fighting not just for the poor but for the very soul of England, gave the legend a new depth. Robin was not just a figure of rebellion but a symbol of the eternal battle between good and evil, right and wrong, the idealized past and the increasingly corrupted present. In the Victorian imagination, the contrast between the rural and urban, the natural and the industrial, became stark. While the upper classes enjoyed the comforts of civilization and industrial progress, the lower classes were left to deal with the crushing weight of poverty and social inequality. Robin Hood, as a romantic hero, offered them an escape, a vision of a world in which there was justice, where the poor could rise up against oppression, and where the forest still held magic and mystery. Robin became a figure of rebellion, not just against the local authorities, but against the dehumanizing forces of the industrialized world. He was the embodiment of nature's rebellion against the corrupt, mechanized world that was slowly but surely swallowing England whole. Yet there was also a bittersweet element to the Victorian revival of Robin Hood. In a world so far removed from the medieval past, where the ideals of chivalry had been all but forgotten, Robin Hood's reign over Sherwood Forest seemed like a dream, a myth of a time that could never truly exist again. As much as Victorian society clung to the idea of a more just, more natural world, they also understood that the rapid pace of change could not be undone. The industrial age, with all its wonders and horrors, was here to stay. Robin Hood's world of freedom in the forest was one that many longed for but could never fully reclaim. It was an ideal, a utopia, that could exist only in stories. The Victorian romanticized Robin Hood as a figure who stood between two worlds, the world of tradition and honor, and the harsh, new world that was being built on the foundations of industry and empire. He was both a hero of the past and a hero for the future, a figure who transcended time, representing the longing for a more just world, a world that existed only in the collective imagination. His legend endures because it is rooted in something deeper than politics, deeper than history. It is rooted in a universal desire for justice, for freedom, and for a world where heroes still walk among us. As the years wore on, Robin Hood's story, once confined to the pages of medieval ballads and the whispers of common folk, began to transform once again. Hollywood, the grand storyteller of the modern era, would soon cast its own spin on this ancient legend. The bright lights of the cinema would bring Robin Hood's tale to the masses, shaping how entire generations of people would come to view this legendary outlaw. What was once a rugged, rebellious figure of folklore evolved into a global icon, his adventures now immortalized on the silver screen. The first major Hollywood adaptation came in 1922, when the silent film Robin Hood, starring Douglas Fairbanks, hit theaters. In the absence of dialogue, it was the physicality of Robin Hood that spoke loudest, his daring acrobatics, his swift archery, and his undeniable charm. The movie painted Robin Hood as an idealized hero, a dashing swashbuckler who was as quick with a quip as he was with his bow. His enemies, chiefly the Sheriff of Nottingham and the evil Prince John, were cartoonishly villainous, their actions exaggerated for dramatic flair. But even in these early films, something deeper began to emerge. Robin Hood was no longer just a symbol of rebellion, but a shining beacon of justice, one whose deeds would be recognized as heroic on a global stage. The 1938 version of The Adventures of Robin Hood, starring Errol Flynn, solidified the hero's place in cinematic history. This colorful, high-energy film introduced Robin as a swashbuckling, charismatic figure, fearless, witty, and always a step ahead of his enemies. Flynn's portrayal of Robin Hood became the definitive version for many years to come. With his perfect hair, gleaming smile, and brave heart, this Robin Hood was as much a product of Hollywood's star-making machine as he was a figure of legend. The film's influence was massive. It was this Robin Hood that would come to define the character in popular culture for decades, an idealized version of chivalry and honor. What Hollywood did best was mold the tale of Robin Hood into an easily digestible story of good versus evil, with all the trimmings of modern heroism. By the 1950s and 60s, Robin Hood's image had become as polished as his legend was vast. He was no longer just an outlaw in a forest, but the quintessential hero who could be trusted to bring down villains with the right combination of charm, skill, and righteousness. Films like Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves, 1991, starring Kevin Costner, introduced Robin to a new generation, this time with a more rugged edge. While some critics were quick to dismiss the film for its departure from historical accuracy, its success proved that Robin Hood's appeal was universal and timeless. With its action-packed sequences, a brooding yet noble hero, and a heavy dose of emotional turmoil, Prince of Thieves gave the story a modern twist that resonated with 90s audiences. Yet, it was not just about action and adventure. In the world of Hollywood's Robin Hood, there was always a sense of emotional depth that connected viewers to this centuries-old tale. Robin became not just a symbol of defiance against the corrupt, but a tragic hero. His motivations were deeply personal. He sought justice not for the sake of rebellion, but for the honor of those who suffered at the hands of the powerful. His love for Maid Marian became a focal point in many of these films, showing a more vulnerable side to the otherwise indomitable outlaw. As the years went on, Robin Hood's relationships were explored more deeply, and his character became layered with the complexities of love, loyalty, and sacrifice. In this era, Robin Hood's transformation continued. As America and the rest of the world grappled with complex social issues, such as civil rights, inequality, and the growing tension between the haves and have-nots, Robin Hood became not just a figure of medieval rebellion, but a symbol of resistance in any era. The modern-day Robin was a champion of the downtrodden, taking up arms against the rich and powerful in a world that often seemed to have little regard for the struggles of the poor. In this sense, Hollywood's Robin Hood tapped into deeper political and social currents, giving the legend a contemporary relevance that resonated with audiences. Even as the character evolved, Robin Hood retained the core values that made him an enduring symbol: justice, loyalty, and the defiance of unjust power. Hollywood's portrayal of these themes transformed Robin Hood into something more than a mere outlaw. He became a hero whose actions transcended the confines of the legend and could inspire people across the world. It wasn't just about stealing from the rich, it was about fighting for what was right, even when the odds seemed impossible. But with this evolution came a certain dilution of the original tale. The historical context in which Robin Hood was first conceived, the harsh reality of medieval England, the struggle for survival, and the rise of rebellion against a corrupt ruling class, became secondary to the spectacle of adventure and heroism. Robin Hood's story became more about entertainment and less about social justice. The complexities of his character were often lost in the chase for thrills and box office numbers. Yet, despite these changes, the core of Robin Hood's appeal remained intact. He was the underdog, the hero that the common person could relate to and cheer for. As the years passed, there was an attempt to return to a more gritty, realistic portrayal of Robin Hood. Ridley Scott's 2010 Robin Hood, starring Russell Crowe, aimed to reinvigorate the legend by placing it in a more historically grounded setting. The film focused on the political upheaval of the time and Robin's role as a figure of rebellion and resistance. This version of Robin Hood was less the charming swashbuckler and more a grizzled, battle-worn hero, deeply connected to the struggles of the people. It was an attempt to reconcile the romanticized version of the outlaw with the harsh realities of medieval life. Yet even in these darker portrayals, Hollywood's version of Robin Hood remains deeply tied to the concept of heroism. Robin Hood, whether depicted as a noble knight or a gritty rebel, continues to embody the hope that one man, standing against a corrupt system, can make a difference. He is the hero who fights for justice, who defies the powerful in the name of the powerless, and who will never stop fighting for a world where fairness prevails. Hollywood's Robin Hood is not just a figure of history or legend. He is the hero for every era, ever evolving, but always with the same fundamental mission: to stand up for what's right, no matter the cost. The sounds of clashing swords, the snap of arrows cutting through the air, the cries of the fallen, violence and bloodshed have always been woven into the fabric of Robin Hood's legend. In a world where the powerful trample over the weak, where greed and corruption run rampant, the only way to fight back was through force. Robin Hood, for all his noble intentions, was no stranger to violence. He fought not just to survive, but to make a stand against an oppressive system that crushed the lives of ordinary people. And in the process, his world became one of constant bloodshed, where every skirmish, every raid, could be the one that would change everything. It wasn't always easy for Robin. Every time he and his band of outlaws took to the woods, it wasn't just about taking down a corrupt official or rescuing a poor peasant, it was about survival. Every encounter with the Sheriff of Nottingham's men, every clash with a knight loyal to Prince John, was a dangerous gamble. The stakes were always high. They had no choice but to fight back with everything they had. To let their blades strike first, to take no prisoners, was the only way they could hold onto their freedom. In a world ruled by those who had power and wealth, the outlaws had nothing but their courage, and even that was often not enough to shield them from the violence that came with their cause. But there was no turning back. Robin Hood's sense of justice, his burning need to right the wrongs of the world, drove him to acts of violence that would define him for generations. He would not allow the suffering of the innocent to continue without standing up to it. He would not allow the elite to bask in their luxury while the common folk starved and suffered. His message was clear, though brutal. If they wanted peace, they would have to fight for it. The battle was inevitable, and with it came the bloodshed. As Robin Hood and his merry men waged their war against the sheriff and the corrupt officials, the violence was not always easy to stomach. There were moments where it seemed as if the line between right and wrong blurred, where the lives lost were not just enemies, but men who had families, too. But to Robin and his men, the harsh realities of the world made it clear, their actions were justified. Each arrow fired, each sword swung, was a strike against an unjust world. Every drop of blood spilled was a message, a symbol that they would never back down, no matter the cost. And yet, there were moments when the brutality of the world overwhelmed them. The sight of an innocent man slain, the screams of a family torn apart, would linger in Robin's mind. There was a quiet sorrow in his heart that even his closest companions could see, a silent acknowledgement that, for all his triumphs, violence had taken a heavy toll on him. Robin may have been a hero, but he was no stranger to the darker side of his actions. The blood that flowed beneath the trees of Sherwood Forest was a reminder of the price of his rebellion. But the bloodshed wasn't always in battle. There were times when Robin Hood's crew, who lived on the fringes of society, always hunted by the law, had to turn to methods outside of what might be considered honorable. Ambushes, traps, the sudden strikes at midnight, all of these were part of their world. They had to be quick, they had to be ruthless, for if they were not, they risked being caught and hanged by the very men they sought to overthrow. The violence wasn't just about retribution, it was survival. And in this world, survival often meant that there were no rules, only outcomes. In the heat of the moment, Robin Hood and his men were consumed by the chaos of their mission. The fight was never just about defeating the sheriff or stealing back from the rich. It was about challenging the very system that kept them down, no matter the price. Robin Hood had to reconcile the blood that was spilled with his desire for justice. Each life taken felt like a necessary sacrifice in the battle against the tyranny of the rich and powerful. But that didn't make it easier. There were always casualties, always moments when the toll of their actions weighed too heavily on their hearts. At times, the violence felt endless. After each victory, there was always another battle to fight, another injustice to right. And every time they emerged victorious, they knew the retaliation would be swift and unforgiving. The cycle of violence would continue, not out of desire, but out of necessity. And the bloodshed would stain the land, leaving behind the scars of a war that would not be won in a single battle. But for the outlaws of Sherwood, there was no turning back. The world they lived in demanded sacrifice. And as much as the violence tore at Robin's soul, he knew there was no other way to win the freedom of the people. For every drop of blood spilled, another life was saved, another step closer to a world where justice could prevail. And so they fought, over and over, knowing that the true battle was not just against their enemies, but against the very system that had led to this endless war. It was a war that could only be won with blood, and they were willing to pay the price. The campfire flickered in the darkness of Sherwood Forest, casting long shadows on the faces of the outlaws who gathered around it. Their laughter and camaraderie filled the air, but beneath the surface, a storm was brewing. In a world where loyalty was a rare treasure, it didn't take much for that treasure to slip through the fingers of the merry men. The bonds that once seemed unbreakable were tested, strained, and, at times, shattered by betrayal. Even within the heart of Robin Hood's outlaw band, there were those who could not be trusted, those whose ambition or fear led them down paths of treachery. It was inevitable. Trust, in a world so fractured and full of danger, was a fragile thing. The merry men had been through countless battles together, their spirits united by the cause. They had fought side by side, shared meals under the same sky, and laughed at the face of danger. But that trust was a tightrope, and one misstep could send it all tumbling into the abyss. And so, it happened. One by one, betrayal crept in, disguised as loyalty. Men who had fought alongside Robin Hood, his closest companions, began to waver. The very people he had considered family, the ones he had trusted with his life, began to question the cause, their loyalty eroded by greed, fear, or doubt. There was no greater example than the betrayal of one of Robin's own, the man who had been closest to him, perhaps the one who shared his vision most deeply, Mungo. Mungo had been with Robin from the beginning, a fierce fighter and a loyal companion. But as time passed, whispers began to swirl. He became distant, his gaze shadowed with something darker, something that spoke of doubt. Robin couldn't see it at first. How could he? He trusted Mungo with his life. They had been brothers, bound by more than just a cause. They had been friends. But the forest had its own way of speaking, and soon enough, Robin heard the first whisper, a word from an informant in the nearby village, a rumor of Mungo's dealings with the sheriff's men. At first, it was laughable. Mungo? Betraying them? But as the pieces began to fall into place, Robin's heart sank. The once unshakable trust had cracked, and the truth hit him like a thunderbolt. Mungo had been feeding information to the sheriff, playing both sides, biding his time for a chance to betray them all for his own gain. The anger and pain that surged through Robin Hood were overwhelming. Betrayal cuts deeper than any sword ever could. It stung, not just because of the action itself, but because it came from someone he considered family. Someone he had shared his heart with, someone he had fought to protect, and yet that very person had turned against him. Mungo had chosen his own survival over the loyalty he had once sworn. The merry men were no longer a brotherhood of trust, they had become a group teetering on the edge of destruction. But Robin was no fool. He knew that to show mercy now would be to risk the entire band. His loyalty to the cause had to come first, even if it meant severing ties with a man he had once called brother. Robin confronted Mungo in the dead of night, the tension between them thick and suffocating. Mungo didn't deny it. He didn't even seem to feel the guilt Robin expected. His eyes were cold, calculating. He had made his choice, and now it was Robin's turn to make his. The confrontation ended with Mungo's exile, his name forever tarnished among the merry men. But the damage was done. The seeds of doubt had been planted. Robin Hood, the fearless leader who had once stood firm against the world, now found himself questioning everything. How could he trust his own men? Was anyone truly loyal? Would the next betrayal come from within his inner circle? The thought haunted him. And Mungo was just the beginning. As the battles grew fiercer, the stakes higher, more cracks began to show. The merry men were no longer the tight-knit band they once were. Men who had fought for Robin's cause began to turn, seduced by the promises of gold, land, and power offered by the sheriff and his men. It wasn't just Mungo who had succumbed to temptation, there were others, too, who had slipped away in the dead of night, their loyalty bought and paid for. Each betrayal was a knife to Robin's heart. He had fought so hard to create a world where the poor could stand up to the rich, where justice was not a commodity for the powerful, but something for all. Yet the men who had sworn to fight for that dream were turning their backs on it, driven by selfish desires. Robin was left to pick up the pieces, to try and hold together a band that was slowly unraveling. But the more he tried to patch things up, the more it seemed like the fabric of the merry men was beyond repair. The question that loomed over Robin became inescapable: was it even possible to build something pure in a world this corrupt? Every time a new betrayal struck, it seemed like the dream of Sherwood Forest, of justice, of freedom, was slipping farther and farther away. And yet, even as the darkness crept in, even as the betrayals piled up one after another, Robin refused to give up. He refused to let the rot of treachery consume him entirely. He knew that for every man who betrayed them, there were still those who remained true. He knew that despite the betrayals, there was still hope. He had to believe that. But the scars left by the betrayals ran deep, and they would haunt him forever. The merry men, once united by loyalty and love for their cause, had become a shadow of their former selves. But even in that darkness, Robin Hood still carried the torch of justice. The question, however, was no longer about how long the merry men could survive. It was about how long Robin could keep fighting for a cause that seemed destined to be destroyed by betrayal. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting long shadows on the stone walls of the sheriff's chambers. The Sheriff of Nottingham, his face hardened by years of watching over the unruly land, sat at his desk, eyes focused on the scroll before him. Outside, the world seemed alive with unrest, but inside the walls of his fortress, a different kind of war was being waged, one of law and order. The sheriff had long been portrayed as the villain, the dark force that hunted Robin Hood and his band of outlaws. But what if there was more to him than the stories let on? What if he wasn't the cold-hearted monster the ballads made him out to be, but rather a man caught in the desperate struggle to maintain control in a fractured world? The sheriff's life was one of constant pressure, where every decision, every command, came with consequences. The land he governed was a place of chaos, where laws were ignored, and the weak were preyed upon by those who had no respect for authority. Robin Hood, with his band of merry men, was a prime example of this lawlessness, a group of outlaws who thought they could live above the rules, steal from the rich, and give to the poor. But the sheriff couldn't allow such anarchy to thrive. His duty was to the crown, to the people, to the law. Without law, there was nothing but chaos, and chaos was a beast that devoured everything in its path. As he sat at his desk, the sheriff reflected on his role. To the people of Nottingham, he was an enforcer, a symbol of authority. But was that all he was? A tool of the rich, a man who stood for oppression? Or was he simply a man trying to keep order in a world that was slipping away from him? His mind wandered to the countless encounters with Robin Hood and his men. Time and time again, they had eluded him, mocked him, and made a mockery of the law he fought so hard to uphold. The outlaws were a thorn in his side, disrupting the delicate balance he worked tirelessly to maintain. Yet, for all his efforts to capture them, there was a part of him that could not ignore the nagging question: why did the people cheer for Robin Hood? Was it truly because they believed in his cause, or because they were simply sick of the harshness of the law? The sheriff had seen firsthand the suffering of the common people. He knew their struggles, their pain, and their yearning for something better. But that didn't mean the laws could be ignored. The law was the backbone of society. Without it, everything would fall apart. Yet, in his moments of quiet reflection, the sheriff could not help but wonder if he was misunderstood. Did the people see him as nothing more than a puppet of the crown, a man with no heart, no understanding of their plight? Did they see his role as one of cruelty and oppression, or did they fail to understand the burden he carried? In truth, the Sheriff of Nottingham was a man trapped between two worlds. On one side, he had the responsibility to uphold the law, to keep order, and to protect the crown. On the other, he had to deal with the reality of a land that was steeped in poverty and suffering, where the wealthy had the power, and the poor were left to fend for themselves. The sheriff often found himself torn between duty and empathy. He knew the injustice the poor faced, but how could he fix it? The laws were written in stone, they were not something he could easily change. And yet, as the outlaws roamed free, stealing and causing havoc, he wondered if he could have done things differently. Could he have been more compassionate? Could he have found a way to help the poor without resorting to the hard hand of the law? But as much as he longed for a solution, he knew that the law could not bend to the will of the people. If it did, there would be no end to the disorder, no end to the chaos. Without law, there could be no peace. It was easy for the people to view the sheriff as a villain. He was the face of authority, the one who imposed the rules. Robin Hood, on the other hand, was the hero, the one who fought for the downtrodden. But the sheriff was not blind to the complexities of the situation. Robin Hood's acts of defiance, his stealing from the rich and giving to the poor, were not as noble as they seemed. In his eyes, Robin was no hero. He was a thief, a bandit who undermined the very foundation of society. Every time Robin Hood struck, It was a blow to the rule of law, a challenge to the stability the sheriff worked tirelessly to protect. Yet, in the quiet moments of his solitude, the sheriff could not shake the feeling that the truth was more complicated. Was he truly the villain, or was he simply the one who had to enforce the rules, no matter how much it hurt? The people cheered for Robin Hood, but they didn't see the full picture. They didn't see the delicate balance the sheriff was trying to maintain, the constant fear of anarchy that loomed over him like a dark cloud. They didn't see how hard it was to be the enforcer of law in a world that seemed to have lost all sense of fairness. As the fire in the hearth began to dim, the sheriff knew that his struggle was far from over. His role in the world was not one of simplicity, it was a constant battle between duty and humanity. And no matter how many times he tried to reason with himself, no matter how much he tried to understand his actions, the question remained, was he truly the villain, or simply a man caught in the desperate fight for order in a world that was falling apart? The wind howled through the trees as Robin Hood paced back and forth, his brow furrowed with frustration. His once proud band of outlaws, now weary and disheartened, sat in the shadows of Sherwood Forest. For all the victories, for all the riches stolen from the greedy, Robin Hood could feel something slipping away, something vital, something irreplaceable. The idealism that had once driven him to take up arms against the tyranny of the Sheriff of Nottingham was starting to crack, and in its place, a deep, gnawing sense of failure began to fester. He had promised the poor that he would protect them, that he would fight for justice. But the more he fought, the more he realized just how impossible it all seemed. For every victory he claimed, for every coin he gave to the poor, the cycle of oppression seemed to spin faster. The rich grew wealthier, the poor stayed hungry, and the lawless continued to evade him. He was not the savior he had hoped to be. Instead, he was becoming a fugitive, a symbol of rebellion that no one could ever truly rely on. His band of merry men, once filled with eager faces and a shared belief in a cause, now seemed fractured. Some had grown disillusioned with their endless struggle. Others, weary from constant running, were beginning to question the path they had chosen. Even Will Scarlet, his old friend, had begun to show signs of doubt. "How long can we keep this up, Robin?" Will had asked, his voice quiet and filled with sorrow. "How long can we steal from the rich and give to the poor when the rich keep taking and the poor keep suffering? Is there an end to this fight? Or is it all just a game of cat and mouse?" Robin Hood had no answers. How could he? Every time he thought they had made a difference, every time they outsmarted the sheriff, it seemed like the weight of their actions was only dragging them further into darkness. The people of Nottingham, the very ones he fought to protect, would cheer when he succeeded. But did they truly understand the cost of his actions? The lives lost in the pursuit of justice? The people he had wronged along the way? The bloodshed, the betrayals, the toll it had taken on his soul. And worse, he had failed to protect those closest to him. Marian, the love of his life, had stood by him through it all. But as the years wore on, she grew more distant, her heart torn between love for the man who fought for justice and the woman who longed for peace and a life beyond the constant warfare. Robin had promised her a better world, a world where the fight against injustice would end in victory. But that promise felt more hollow with every passing day. What had he truly accomplished? His enemies had been pushed back, yes, but they were always one step ahead. The Sheriff of Nottingham, his greatest adversary, was relentless. For every man Robin Hood took down, 100 more rose to take his place. For every coin they gave to the poor, the rich found a way to take it back. The more Robin fought, the more it seemed that the system was simply too entrenched, too vast, to topple. He was a symbol, yes, but what did that matter when the people still lived in fear, when the poor still starved, and when the rich still held all the power? Robin's failures were not just in battle, they were in his inability to change the system, to find a solution that worked for everyone. He had become so focused on fighting against the corruption, the greed, the injustice that he had lost sight of something crucial. He had lost sight of the people he was fighting for. The merry men, the poor peasants of Nottingham, and even Marian, they all needed more than a hero who could steal from the rich. They needed a solution, a way out of the endless cycle of poverty and oppression. Robin Hood had given them hope, but what had he truly given them? A fleeting victory, a stolen moment of joy before the harsh reality returned. As the night grew darker, Robin sat by the fire, his head in his hands. He had always prided himself on being a leader, a protector of the weak, a hero. But the weight of his failures pressed down on him like an invisible hand, suffocating him with its sheer force. What good was being a hero if it didn't change anything? What good was his rebellion if it only led to more pain, more loss, and more bloodshed? In that moment, Robin Hood understood something he had refused to acknowledge for so long. The fight was never going to be won with swords and arrows. The rebellion he had started, the ideals he had fought for, could never be achieved through violence alone. He had thought that by taking from the rich, by defying the law, by being the outlaw, he could make a difference. But all he had done was perpetuate a cycle of violence, one that would never end as long as the world remained the way it was. He could hear the distant laughter of his men, their voices rising and falling as they told stories around the campfire. For a moment, it seemed like nothing had changed. But deep inside, Robin Hood knew that everything had changed. He had failed. And that realization, as painful as it was something he could no longer ignore. He had lost sight of the true meaning of his mission. He had fought for a world where justice reigned, but in doing so, he had become a part of the very system he despised. The cycle of violence had become his own. With a heavy heart, Robin stood, his eyes cast downward as he turned away from the fire. He didn't know what the future held, or if there was even a way out of the path he had chosen. All he knew was that the dream he had once held was fading, slipping through his fingers like sand. And in its place, the weight of failure pressed down, a burden he would carry for the rest of his days. In every corner of the world, throughout history, there have been men and women who stood defiant in the face of injustice, carving out their names as heroes in the stories of their people. These figures, often regarded as outlaws by the authorities of their time, became symbols of resistance, justice, and the fight against corruption. They weren't just criminals in the eyes of the law, but heroes to the oppressed, their actions stirring the hearts of those who felt powerless. Across the oceans, in the mountains and deserts, in dense jungles and bustling cities, outlaw heroes emerged, some forgotten with time, others immortalized in folklore. Each one, like Robin Hood, represented a defiance against the systems that controlled and oppressed their people. They were the voices of the voiceless, the fists raised in protest against tyranny. Take, for example, the legend of Zorro, whose name became synonymous with masked heroism in the Spanish-speaking world. Much like Robin Hood, Zorro was a man of wealth who chose to become an outlaw, fighting against the corrupt officials who plundered the poor. Don Diego de la Vega, the nobleman who donned the mask, was driven by a desire to protect the helpless, to defend the dignity of the downtrodden. His actions became a beacon of hope for the oppressed, even as he lived in constant danger of being unmasked by the very authorities he defied. Like Robin Hood, Zorro made his mark by stealing from the rich and giving to the poor, his very identity a symbol of justice in a corrupt society. In the rugged hills of the Appalachian Mountains, Frank and Jesse James emerged as infamous figures in American folklore. The brothers, once Confederate soldiers, became notorious outlaws after the Civil War, engaging in bank robberies and daring train heists. To the eyes of the law, they were criminals, but to the people of the South, they were symbols of rebellion, heroes who fought back against the Union forces that had ravaged their homes and livelihoods. They were seen as folk heroes, outlaws who fought for a cause they believed in, even if that cause was controversial. Their tale, one of lawlessness and loyalty to their roots, resonated with the underdog, the forgotten and disenfranchised. In China, the legendary figure of Song Jiang, also known as the Black Whirlwind, offers a story similar to Robin Hood's, but with its own unique twists. As the leader of the 108 outlaws in the classic novel Watermargin, or Outlaws of the Marsh, Song Jiang stood as a leader of men who had been wronged by the system. These outlaws, living on the fringes of society, were driven to crime out of a need for survival, but they became a formidable force of resistance against the corrupt officials and imperial forces. Much like Robin Hood's merry men, Song Jiang's band was united by a shared cause, the desire to resist the oppressive rulers and fight for justice. Despite their status as criminals, they were seen as defenders of the common people, challenging an unjust system with their might and their courage. Across the seas in Mexico, the legend of Pancho Villa took root. Born into poverty, Villa rose to prominence during the Mexican Revolution, becoming a symbol of the struggle for land reform and social justice. His band of rebels, much like Robin Hood's, took up arms not just for personal gain but for the rights of the people. Villa, often referred to as a bandit, was a charismatic leader who challenged the elites, demanding a redistribution of land and resources to the oppressed peasants. His raids against wealthy landowners and corrupt officials made him a hero in the eyes of the peasantry, a man who stood up for the forgotten, much like the legendary outlaw of Sherwood Forest. In India, the tale of Chandrasekhar Azad reflects the same spirit of resistance. An icon in the struggle for Indian independence, Azad was known for his fearless defiance against British colonial rule. He became an outlaw in the eyes of the British, wanted for his revolutionary activities. With his unyielding determination, he continued to fight for his country's freedom, symbolizing the fight against imperial oppression. Though not a traditional bandit in the sense of Robin Hood, Azad's actions reflected the same defiant courage. His life was a testament to the power of resistance against those who wielded power unjustly, even if it meant being branded an outlaw by the very people he sought to liberate. The Maori people of New Zealand also have their own outlaw heroes, such as Te Kuti, a leader of a rebellion against British colonial forces in the late 19th century. Te Kuti's story is one of injustice, resistance, and survival. After being falsely imprisoned, he became the leader of a group of Maori resistance fighters, battling against the European settlers who had taken control of their land. His actions were often viewed as criminal by the colonial government, but to his people, he was a hero, a warrior fighting to reclaim his land and his people's freedom. Even in the world of pirates, legends arose that mirrored the spirit of Robin Hood. The most famous among them, Captain Kidd, was once a privateer for the British Empire before turning to piracy. While he plundered the seas for his own gain, his story, like that of Robin Hood, has become one of a hero who rebelled against the systems that governed him. In popular culture, pirates like Captain Kidd, Blackbeard, and others were often portrayed as folk heroes, rebels who lived outside the law, but whose defiance represented a form of freedom, adventure, and an escape from the oppressive norms of society. What connects all these figures is not merely their status as outlaws, but their shared qualities as symbols of rebellion against the powers that sought to oppress their people. Like Robin Hood, they fought not for personal gain but for a sense of justice that resonated with the common folk. They were, in their own way, legends, etched into the fabric of their cultures, their stories passed down through generations. These outlaw heroes of different cultures may have worn different masks and fought for different causes, but they all embodied the same spirit of defiance, of standing up against the unjust forces of their time. Whether with a bow and arrow, a sword, or a gun, they carved their names into the stories of their people, forever remembered as symbols of resistance and hope. The figure of the rebel hero is timeless, a symbol that transcends cultures, ages, and continents. These individuals, often misunderstood, sometimes vilified, become the beating heart of resistance, challenging oppressive systems with courage, determination, and a deep sense of justice. The rebel hero does not seek glory for personal gain but fights against the powers that aim to crush the common people. In every story of rebellion, the essence of the rebel hero shines through, whether through myth, legend, or history. At the core of the rebel hero's archetype is a deep dissatisfaction with the existing order. This dissatisfaction is often rooted in personal injustice, whether it's the loss of a loved one, a personal betrayal, or the oppression faced by the masses. The rebel hero feels the sting of unfairness and cannot rest until they make things right, even if that means becoming an outlaw in the eyes of society. They are driven not by selfish desires, but by a sense of duty to the people they serve, the ones who are too weak, too disenfranchised to fight for themselves. One of the most crucial elements of the rebel hero is their outsider status. They often begin as part of the system, an insider who, for reasons beyond their control, comes to realize the system is flawed. Whether born into a noble family, trained as a soldier, or raised as a protector, the rebel hero always starts from a place of belonging. However, their awareness of corruption within the system forces them to choose a different path. They become outcasts, rebels who fight not for their personal benefit but to challenge the tyranny of those who exploit the weak and powerless. Take, for instance, the classic example of Robin Hood. Born into nobility, he could have lived a life of privilege. Yet, when he witnessed the oppression and exploitation of the common people by corrupt authorities, he chose to fight against the system. His transformation from nobleman to outlaw was driven not by selfish desires, but by his deep empathy for the suffering of the poor. Robin Hood's rebellion was not an act of violence for violence's sake, but rather an attempt to restore balance and justice to a world ruled by greed and corruption. What makes the rebel hero so compelling is their unwavering sense of justice. Unlike the traditional hero who may seek personal glory, wealth, or power, the rebel hero's motivations are rooted in a larger cause, social, political, or moral change. They stand as symbols of the oppressed, as advocates for those who cannot fight for themselves. In their eyes, the fight for justice is more important than any personal gain. They fight not for recognition, but for the dignity of others, often at great personal cost. The Maori leader, Te Kuti, represents another example of the rebel hero in action. After being wrongfully imprisoned, Te Kuti rose to lead a resistance against colonial forces in New Zealand. His deep sense of injustice, the brutal treatment of his people by European settlers, fueled his defiance. Despite being labeled an outlaw, Te Kuti fought for the freedom and rights of the Maori people. His struggle was not just for personal survival, but for the survival of his culture and way of life. Like Robin Hood, his actions blurred the lines between criminal and hero, as he became a symbol of resistance against a system that oppressed his people. The rebel hero is also deeply connected to nature and the land. Their fight often transcends the physical battle against their oppressors. It becomes a battle for the soul of their nation, their people, or their culture. In this sense, the rebel hero is not just a fighter, but a protector, one who defends the natural world, the traditions, and the very essence of what makes their community unique. In the story of Pancho Villa, the Mexican revolutionary leader, this connection to the land and the people is evident. Villa fought not just against foreign oppressors, but also against the exploitation of the rural Mexican peasants, who had long been denied access to land and resources. Villa's rebellion was grounded in the land itself, the fight to return what had been stolen from the people, to restore dignity to the poor and disenfranchised. His struggle mirrored the rebel hero's archetype, one who fights for justice, for freedom, and for the right of the people to live with honor and respect. A defining trait of the rebel hero is their ability to inspire others. While they begin as outcasts, their actions resonate with those who have felt the sting of injustice. The rebel hero ignites a spark in the hearts of the oppressed, who see in them not just a fighter, but a symbol of hope. Whether through words, actions, or sheer determination, the rebel hero becomes a rallying point for those who seek change. The stories of their courage, their unflinching dedication to the cause, and their willingness to sacrifice themselves for the greater good spread like wildfire, encouraging others to rise up and join the fight. This is evident in the legend of Zorro, the masked outlaw who fought for justice in Spanish California. Zorro was more than just a criminal. He was a symbol of defiance against corrupt officials, a hero who stood for the oppressed. His cunning and bravery, paired with his iconic mask and sword, made him a figure of inspiration, a figure who struck fear into the hearts of the corrupt and gave hope to the people. Like Robin Hood, Zorro's rebellion was rooted in a desire to correct the injustices of society, to create a world where fairness and equality prevailed. The rebel hero is also marked by their constant struggle. Though they often find success in their rebellion, the path they walk is never easy. The obstacles they face are immense, and the sacrifices they make are often painful and costly. The rebel hero cannot rest, for the work is never done. They face betrayal, violence, and heartbreak, yet they continue to fight, driven by an unrelenting belief in their cause. Their journey is long, their path fraught with peril, yet they persist, embodying the very spirit of resistance and change. The rebel hero also frequently faces internal conflict. Though they fight for justice, they are often forced to make difficult choices that challenge their morals and beliefs. To achieve their goals, they may need to break the law, to use violence, or to compromise their values. These moments of doubt and inner struggle make the rebel hero all the more human, all the more relatable. In their quest for justice, they are not perfect, but they are unwavering in their commitment to the cause. In the end, the rebel hero's story is one of defiance, sacrifice, and the pursuit of justice. These heroes may be labeled as outlaws by society, but in the hearts of the oppressed, they are forever remembered as champions of the people. Whether through their deeds or their words, the rebel hero sparks change, igniting the flames of resistance that burn brightly for generations to come. They are a reminder that, sometimes, in order to right the wrongs of the world, one must be willing to break the rules and stand tall against the powers that be. The story of Robin Hood, deeply entrenched in the English medieval past, has transcended time and geography, becoming a symbol for rebellion in colonial and post-colonial contexts. Although the tale began as a critique of Norman authority over Saxon peasants, it has, over centuries, been appropriated and reinterpreted by various oppressed groups around the world. Robin Hood's legend has provided the blueprint for many who found themselves under colonial rule, resonating as a metaphor for resistance against foreign domination, inequality, and injustice. In the context of colonialism, Robin Hood's defiance against the Sheriff of Nottingham and the corrupt nobility represented more than just a local rebellion. His character came to symbolize the universal struggle of the oppressed against exploitative power structures. Colonized peoples, whether in India, Africa, or the Caribbean, found in Robin Hood's story a model of rebellion that transcended borders. He was no longer just an outlaw fighting to restore fairness to England, he became the symbol of resistance against foreign invaders and the corrupt local rulers who collaborated with them. One powerful example of Robin Hood's influence is seen in the Indian independence movement. Figures like Subhas Chandra Bose, Bhagat Singh, and other revolutionaries who fought against British colonial rule drew inspiration from the ideals of Robin Hood. Like Robin Hood, they fought to dismantle a system that sought to drain resources from the land and exploit the people. These heroes, though they were often labeled as criminals by the British, saw themselves as champions of the oppressed, fighting for freedom and justice. Much like Robin Hood's band of merry men, these leaders were often seen as outsiders, fighting not for their own personal gain, but for the liberty and dignity of their people. The colonial setting brought with it a clear divide between the ruling class and the colonized. Robin Hood's legacy in such societies was not one of simple theft, but of subverting a system that was designed to enrich a foreign power while leaving the indigenous population in poverty and subjugation. The Robin Hood archetype, then, was reimagined as a form of symbolic guerrilla warfare, a way for colonized peoples to fight back against the structures that kept them oppressed. In a land where justice was often denied, Robin Hood's story was a reminder that resistance could take many forms, and that fighting back against oppression was both necessary and noble. In the Caribbean, during the era of slavery and colonial exploitation, Robin Hood's legend took on a more radical tone. The enslaved peoples, often stripped of their dignity and subjected to brutal treatment, found in Robin Hood a symbol of hope. His acts of defiance against the Sheriff of Nottingham were seen as a direct parallel to the resistance against the plantation owners and colonial forces. In a time when slavery was widespread, Robin Hood's rebellion became a story of how the powerless could defy and even overcome the might of the powerful. The oppressed slaves and their descendants, as they fought for their freedom, began to see themselves as Robin Hood-like figures, outlaws in the eyes of their colonial masters, but heroes in the eyes of their fellow rebels and communities. This appropriation of Robin Hood's image can also be seen in post-colonial narratives. Once a colony achieves independence, the need to rewrite history becomes paramount, and stories like Robin Hood's are reshaped to suit the new political context. Chilean revolutionary poet and politician Pablo Neruda referred to the Robin Hood legend in his works, drawing comparisons between the social justice that Robin Hood fought for and the inequalities present in post-colonial Latin American societies. As former colonies struggled to establish their own identity and often faced economic challenges, the legend of Robin Hood was used as a powerful tool for social critique, symbolizing the fight against poverty, inequality, and corrupt governments. In Africa, the legend of Robin Hood provided an archetype that was adopted by revolutionary leaders fighting against colonial rule, but also by post-colonial figures confronting corruption in their own governments. The tale's themes of justice, redistribution of wealth, and fighting against an unjust system resonated strongly with African nationalists who sought to dismantle colonial rule and build new, more just societies. Whether it was Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana, Julius Nyerere in Tanzania, or Nelson Mandela in South Africa, these leaders adopted a Robin Hood-like sense of morality in their fight against colonial powers, and later against post-colonial corruption and inequality. The story also found relevance in the American Revolution. During the years leading up to independence from British rule, the American colonists, many of whom saw themselves as oppressed by the British Empire, turned to figures like Robin Hood to inspire their cause. Robin Hood's ability to defy authority and redistribute wealth to the people became an early inspiration for the colonists, who viewed their struggle as one for freedom, fairness, and justice, very much in the spirit of Robin Hood's defiance against tyranny. The band of brothers who joined Robin in his cause could easily be likened to the early revolutionaries who stood together to oppose British rule in the colonies. Interestingly, the legend of Robin Hood has also been embraced by those in the post-colonial world who find themselves fighting against the abuses of the newly established government systems. As nations gained independence, many hoped for a brighter future. But, like any transition, it was fraught with corruption, economic hardship, and political betrayal. In these new nations, the tale of Robin Hood's defiance and sense of justice has been reimagined as a critique of post-colonial leadership and corruption. Political figures and activists have taken up the mantle of the Robin Hood figure, demanding social justice and the fair treatment of all citizens, especially the disenfranchised. The legend of Robin Hood also touches upon the central issue of land and resource distribution, which is a constant theme in post-colonial struggles. In countries where colonization stripped away the land from indigenous populations or where the ruling class continues to hoard wealth while the majority suffers in poverty, Robin Hood's story continues to resonate. The idea that the wealthy and powerful are responsible for hoarding resources while the people starve has become a central theme in post-colonial critiques of both colonial powers and the new ruling elites. The Robin Hood archetype thus endures as a powerful force for social and political change in the modern world, a symbol of rebellion against not only colonial rulers but the injustices that persist long after independence has been won. As the world moves into the post-colonial era, the legend of Robin Hood endures in the hearts and minds of the oppressed, reminding them that the fight for justice is never truly over. The figure of Robin Hood remains a beacon of hope, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there are those who will rise up and take a stand, no matter the cost. The colonizers may have left, but the struggles of the people, fighting against inequality, injustice, and corruption, continue, with Robin Hood's spirit still very much alive in the hearts of those who dare to dream of a better world. The legend of Robin Hood, that of the outlaw who steals from the rich to give to the poor, has captured the imagination of countless generations. While it is impossible to pin down a single historical figure as the true inspiration for this iconic character, over the years, several candidates have been suggested as potential sources for Robin Hood's creation. Some are figures who existed in the medieval period, others are characters woven from myth, but all share certain traits that echo the values of the legendary outlaw: rebellion, justice, and resistance against tyranny. One of the earliest figures tied to the Robin Hood legend is Robert Hood or Robin of Locksley, a name that appears in various early ballads. The name Robin Hood itself seems to have evolved from such historical figures, and many historians believe it's possible that multiple individuals, rather than just one, helped shape the outlaw's persona. From the 12th century onwards, the tale has merged and evolved, drawing on real and mythical figures who represented defiance against authority and a longing for justice. A figure named Robert Hood or Robin of Locksley appears in early ballads and documents, though the details are scarce. Some believe that this Robert Hood could have been a 13th century outlaw or a dispossessed nobleman who operated around Nottinghamshire or Yorkshire. These early mentions of a Robert in these ballads may be linked to the Robin Hood legend in its infancy. His connection to a particular place, Locksley, would later appear in later iterations of the Robin Hood tale as Robin of Locksley. This individual might have been a local rebel, a knight or landowner who lost his lands and privileges to a corrupt system, much like the Robin Hood of legend. However, it's worth noting that the historical Robert Hood or Robin of Locksley does not appear to have led the kind of grand band of outlaws that the later ballads describe. Thus, it's likely that this figure served as one of several kernels around which the larger-than-life outlaw grew. Another figure linked to Robin Hood is Eustace the Monk, a 13th-century pirate and mercenary who rebelled against authority. Eustace was a monk who turned rogue, becoming a pirate and leading a band of followers, much like Robin Hood's merry men. He became famous for his raids along the English coast, resisting the monarchy and even fighting against King John's forces. His rebellious nature and audacity made him a known figure of resistance during a time of great instability, and his story shares many elements with the Robin Hood legend, defying authority, operating outside the law, and using guerrilla tactics to upset the status quo. Eustace's pirate lifestyle and rebel persona seem to fit perfectly with the outlaw image of Robin Hood. While Eustace was ultimately betrayed and captured, his life likely served as a model for the later Robin Hood tales, inspiring the myth of the noble outlaw who lives by his wits, defies authority, and steals from the wealthy. Another possible inspiration for Robin Hood is Fulk Fitzwarren, a 12th-century nobleman who lost his lands in a conflict with the king. Fulk's story of rebellion and outlaw status mirrors that of Robin Hood in many ways. After falling out of favor with King John, Fulk became a notorious outlaw, fleeing to the wilderness and engaging in battles against the king's forces. His conflict with the crown and his eventual return to prominence after a period of rebellion bears a strong resemblance to the trajectory of Robin Hood's character, an individual fighting for justice and reclaiming his rightful place. Like Robin Hood, Fulk was an outsider fighting against a corrupt system, and the stories of his life, especially his exile and eventual restoration, mirror the structure of many Robin Hood ballads. His status as an outlaw with a noble past and his battles against authority would have made his life an excellent source for the myth that would later emerge. Some historians suggest that Hugh de Cressingham, a 13th-century knight who served as treasurer to King Edward I, could have inspired Robin Hood. Though not exactly a traditional outlaw, Cressingham was a highly unpopular figure in medieval England due to his harsh taxation policies and heavy-handed rule in Scotland. His brutal reputation and close ties to the monarchy make him a likely candidate for the Sheriff of Nottingham in Robin Hood's tale. In fact, it's speculated that figures like Cressingham, who represented the corrupt and oppressive systems of medieval rule, helped shape the character of the sheriff, the antagonist that Robin Hood must battle. While Cressingham himself did not become an outlaw, his role as a symbol of wealth and privilege in a time of inequality reflects the types of figures that Robin Hood fought against. As the legend developed, characters like Cressingham could have influenced the development of the antagonist and reinforced the narrative of Robin Hood's battle for justice. Another figure whose life may have shaped the Robin Hood story is William Wallace, the Scottish hero who fought against English rule in the late 13th century. Wallace's role as a bandit-like figure, leading a resistance against a foreign oppressor, mirrors the qualities of Robin Hood. Wallace's battles for Scottish independence and his role as a symbol of defiance made him a hero to the Scottish people, much as Robin Hood became a hero to the English poor. Wallace's legendary rebellion against Edward I, along with his eventual execution, may have paralleled some of the themes found in Robin Hood tales: defiance against a corrupt king, an appeal to the common people, and a resistance that rose out of personal tragedy. Though their methods and goals were different, the idea of fighting against an oppressive authority links Wallace's story with that of Robin Hood. Finally, there is the theory that Robin Hood is not directly inspired by any one historical figure, but rather emerges from a mix of historical events and folk myths. Some believe that the Saxon resistance to Norman rule after the 1066 conquest could have birthed the Robin Hood legend. In the aftermath of the Norman conquest, the Saxons rebelled against their new rulers, and various figures of resistance may have contributed to the larger myth of Robin Hood. The Saxon rebellion against Norman oppression could have led to stories of a noble outlaw who fought against foreign rulers, hiding in the forest and robbing the rich to restore wealth to the oppressed. As these stories spread and changed over the centuries, they morphed into the Robin Hood legend we know today, a composite of rebellion, resistance, and the desire for justice. The historical figures linked to Robin Hood vary widely, but all share the same core themes of rebellion, justice, and defiance against an oppressive system. Whether it was Eustace the Monk, Fulk Fitzwarren, or the more legendary Saxon rebels, Robin Hood's legend likely draws from a blend of these figures, each contributing pieces to the broader story of the outlaw hero. Through centuries of storytelling, the Robin Hood legend evolved into something much greater than any one individual, becoming a symbol for oppressed people everywhere. In the annals of medieval history, legal records and chronicles serve as critical windows into the past, offering glimpses of the political, social, and cultural landscape of the time. But what do these documents say about Robin Hood, the legendary outlaw who defied the rich and helped the poor? Was he simply a character of folklore, or could there have been a real man behind the myth? The idea that Robin Hood might have once been a flesh and blood figure is an alluring one, and some historians have turned to legal records and medieval chronicles in hopes of finding hard evidence. Most of the earliest mentions of Robin Hood appear in ballads and literature, but the search for legal documentation is a different matter altogether. In an age where literacy was limited and records were often meticulously kept by the clergy or the ruling elite, it would be highly unusual for someone like Robin Hood, living outside the law, to leave behind a clear and undeniable paper trail. Nevertheless, several documents, records, and historical accounts have been scrutinized over time in the pursuit of answers. The first legal mentions of Robin Hood. The earliest legal references to Robin Hood are few and far between, but they do exist. One of the most significant sources that some historians turn to is the Pipe Rolls of Sherwood Forest, which are financial records kept by the English crown, especially during the reign of King Henry II, 12th century. These records document landholdings, taxes, and various expenses within the kingdom. While Robin Hood is never explicitly mentioned by name in these records, some scholars believe that outlaws who roamed the Sherwood Forest were frequently noted in these documents. Sherwood Forest itself was a royal hunting ground, and its management was central to English law. In this setting, outlaws who defied the authority of the crown and lived off the land would have been a thorn in the side of the authorities. There are references to various figures, particularly forest outlaws, who would have been viewed as criminals under the strict laws of the time. Robin Hood could very well be one of these outlaws, a common man rising up against the oppressive systems, a symbol of rebellion, though no direct documentation can conclusively place him in the official records. The 13th century chronicles. The first true chronicles to mention Robin Hood come from the 13th century, long after the Norman conquest and during a time when the legend was beginning to take form in English folklore. The Chronicle of the Kings of England, also known as the Chronicle of Roger of Wendover, was one of the earliest historical works to allude to the legendary figure. This document includes a reference to Robin Hood's activities in the context of the Sheriff of Nottingham and other figures from the ballads. However, the mention is brief, and it is impossible to determine whether Robin Hood was an actual person or merely a symbol of the growing resistance to the Norman rule and later injustices. The chronicles were often written for political purposes, aiming to glorify certain kings and their reigns, so references to outlaws like Robin Hood were usually vague, often without concrete historical evidence. The Black Book of the Exchequer. One of the more intriguing documents that may allude to Robin Hood is the Black Book of the Exchequer, a compilation of royal finances, taxation, and land records. Among the more mundane records, there are references to forest laws and taxes that directly impacted the lives of peasants and commoners, many of whom could have turned to outlaws like Robin Hood as a form of resistance. Some scholars speculate that the book might contain allusions to Robin Hood's rebellion against the Norman aristocracy, though these references remain indirect. The book, which was written in the 13th century, documents how England's rural populations were affected by royal policies. As the tax burden grew and the legal system became more oppressive, the idea of a man like Robin Hood, who would challenge authority and redistribute wealth, gained widespread popularity. The Black Book captures a snapshot of the society in which these rebellious tales could have emerged, yet no explicit mention of Robin Hood exists. The Assize Rolls. The Assize Rolls are a treasure trove of legal documents that record court proceedings across medieval England. They give an invaluable picture of life in the period, revealing conflicts, disputes, and judicial processes. Within these roles, there are occasional references to outlaws, bandits, and individuals wanted for crimes in the forests of Nottinghamshire, Derbyshire, and Yorkshire. Though there are no conclusive records linking these criminals to Robin Hood himself, many of the outlaws mentioned in these roles bear striking similarities to the legendary figure in terms of their activities. For example, a notorious outlaw named William de Wely, known for his exploits in the forests of Nottinghamshire, is mentioned in the assize rolls of 1226. He was considered an enemy of the crown, much like the Robin Hood figure. William de Wely, along with others, was known for engaging in activities that directly aligned with the tales of Robin Hood, stealing from the wealthy, defying the Sheriff of Nottingham, and operating from the forests. Could these mentions point to Robin Hood, or perhaps to other outlaws in a similar vein? The historical ambiguity makes it difficult to say definitively. However, the sheer presence of these criminal figures in the same region and time period suggests that Robin Hood's rebellion may have had real-life roots in such outlaws. The Chronicles of the Reign of Richard the Lionheart. Another historical text that indirectly references figures like Robin Hood is found in the Chronicles of the Reign of King Richard I, Richard the Lionheart. These chronicles, including works like the Chronicles of Ralph of Coggeshall and the Chronicle of the Kings of England, depict the tumultuous years when Richard was away fighting the Crusades, and Prince John ruled as regent. The taxation and corruption of the era set the stage for many of the Robin Hood stories to flourish. As Richard was away and the kingdom was governed by a corrupt regent, many of the poor found themselves at the mercy of unfair taxes and exploitation by local authorities. Some of the chronicles, though not explicitly mentioning Robin Hood, reflect the kinds of struggles that would have inspired such a legendary figure. The themes of rebellion, corruption, and the abuse of power are central to these chronicles, and it is in this very environment that the Robin Hood legend may have blossomed. The search for the real Robin Hood. Despite the scattered references to outlaws and bandits in the medieval records, direct references to Robin Hood himself are strikingly absent in contemporary legal and historical documents. The absence of a concrete paper trail leads some historians to question whether Robin Hood was ever a real person, or whether his story was built from the deeds of various outlaws whose names were lost to history. Perhaps the character was not meant to be one specific individual, but rather a symbolic representation of a common theme in medieval society: the fight against tyranny, the desire for justice, and the defiance of corrupt rulers. In the end, legal records and medieval chronicles offer glimpses into the world in which Robin Hood might have existed, but they remain shrouded in mystery. The figure of Robin Hood, whether based on one individual or a collection of outlaws, lives on in history as a symbol of resistance and justice, regardless of the historical gaps that remain. In the dim light of a flickering fire, surrounded by the quiet rustle of the forest, a voice rises, carrying the weight of history through the ages. The words spoken are not just tales, they are lifeblood, passing through generations, shifting ever so slightly with each telling. Oral traditions have always been the vessel through which stories, legends, and histories are passed down, and within these rich traditions, the legend of Robin Hood found its form. Long before the first ballads were written, long before legal records and historical texts began to preserve facts, oral storytelling shaped the very essence of how we remember the past. It was in these moments, by the warmth of hearths and in the gathering of communities, that Robin Hood's name was whispered, then roared, across villages and towns. Through these stories, Robin Hood became more than just an outlaw. He became a symbol, a hero, a voice for the oppressed. But the question remains, how did oral traditions mold the legend, and what histories were lost along the way? The power of spoken word. In an age where books were a rarity, and written language was a privilege of the elite, the spoken word was the only means of preserving memory. In the medieval period, oral traditions were crucial in maintaining the stories that would define a culture and its values. Bards and minstrels roamed the land, and their role was essential in the transmission of history. They didn't just sing songs of kings and battles, they sang of the common people, of those who lived in the shadows of the rich and powerful. Robin Hood's tale began as oral folklore, recited from village to village, each teller adding their own unique twist. These stories evolved with every telling, gaining new layers, new details, and new characters, always in service of the larger theme, the defiance of injustice, the hope of equality, and the dream of freedom. The fluidity of the legend. As Robin Hood's story passed from mouth to mouth, details began to shift. In one telling, Robin might have been a nobleman, wronged by the crown, and in another, he might be simply a common man with a cause. In some versions, his merry men might have included a range of outlaws, from the jester-like Friar Tuck to the quiet but deadly Little John. Each version carried a different flavor depending on the region and the teller's perspective. Oral traditions are not bound by the rigidity of written records. Tellers are free to inject their emotions, their personal struggles, and their interpretations into the story. This fluidity gave birth to a Robin Hood that could adapt and grow alongside the people who needed him most. As the oppressed suffered under burdens of taxation, as feudalism wreaked havoc on the poor, the story of Robin Hood resonated. He became every man's hero, a bandit not for personal gain, but for the benefit of the voiceless. The hero's archetype. At the core of Robin Hood's legend, carried through the rhythms of oral tradition, is the timeless figure of the rebel hero. The basic elements remained intact across all versions, a hero living in the wild, defying authority, fighting against injustice, and ultimately standing for something greater than himself. Whether he stole from the rich to give to the poor, fought to protect the downtrodden, or challenged corrupt rulers, his story was one of resilience in the face of tyranny. In every village, Robin's tale took on new layers of meaning. For some, he was a symbol of class struggle, fighting back against the exploitation of the poor. For others, he represented a righteous rebellion against the corruption of the crown and the abuse of power by those in authority. His tale transformed into whatever the listener needed it to be, but always carrying that same thread of resistance and moral clarity. Robin was a reflection of what the people yearned for in their own lives: justice, freedom, and equality. Lost histories, a reflection of the time. While the oral tradition preserved Robin Hood's spirit, it also obscured much of the history behind his story. These stories, passed down through generations, are not always reliable records of events. They reflect the hopes and fears of the time more than they offer factual details. In the case of Robin Hood, the true historical roots of the legend are buried deep in the shifts and changes of the story's retelling. What is fascinating, though, is how these oral accounts also serve as a reflection of the time in which they were told. When Robin Hood's stories were first circulating, they likely emerged in response to the feudal oppression and taxation that plagued common folk in medieval England. The tales gave voice to the powerless, a form of resistance that was hidden within the fabric of entertainment. As such, they became difficult to separate from the actual realities of the time. It's likely that Robin Hood's character was not simply an invention of storytelling, but an embodiment of real events, both personal and political. He could have been inspired by the very real, though unnamed, figures who fought against the abuses of power. But with each retelling, the historical accuracy faded, replaced by a larger-than-life hero who was not bound by the facts, but by the hopes and dreams of the common people. Myth-making and the power of imagination. Oral traditions have always been a fertile ground for myth-making. Stories, passed along with passion and conviction, morph over time into powerful myths, embodying the ideal rather than the real. In Robin Hood's case, his myth grew from the kernel of a simple outlaw, perhaps a disgruntled noble or rebel, into a figure whose identity was shaped by the desires and dreams of those who told the tale. Through this lens, Robin Hood became more than just a man. He became a symbol of the human spirit's resistance to oppression. The core of Robin Hood's tale was freedom, a freedom that resonated deeply with those who lived under the boot of tyranny. His legend, carried in the voices of the people, became a form of escape. It was a way for the oppressed to imagine a world in which the powerful were toppled and justice prevailed. Through the art of oral storytelling, Robin Hood transcended his historical roots and became an immortal figure. The enduring nature of oral tradition. Even as written texts eventually took hold and historians tried to pin down the facts of Robin Hood's life, the oral tradition still remains the most powerful force in shaping the way we view his legacy. Today, as much as we rely on historical records and books, it is still the power of storytelling that keeps Robin Hood alive. His name is passed along by voice, by film, by songs, and through the very fabric of modern culture. In the end, Robin Hood is not just a man, he is the legend, built and shaped by countless voices over time. His story is alive, constantly adapting, constantly evolving, always reflecting the need for justice and freedom in the face of power. And as long as people continue to tell the story, Robin Hood will never truly be forgotten. The oral tradition is not just a medium for the past, it is the heartbeat of history, carrying with it not just facts, but the emotions, hopes, and struggles of those who live it. In the shadow of towering cityscapes and among the hum of modern life, the legend of Robin Hood still pulses like a steady drumbeat, echoing through the veins of political and social movements. The story of a man who defies authority, challenges systems of oppression, and stands for the downtrodden resonates with us in ways that go beyond mere nostalgia. Even in the 21st century, the tale of Robin Hood, an outlaw turned hero, continues to stir hearts, shape ideologies, and fuel revolutions, both in the streets and in the halls of power. The narrative of Robin Hood, one who steals from the rich and gives to the poor, has become a symbol, a rallying cry for disenfranchised communities, activists, and even political leaders. It's a message wrapped in resistance, justice, and rebellion that transcends the ages. From the glistening world of capitalist economies to the cries for social justice, Robin Hood's legacy remains an undeniable force that ignites change, challenges the status quo, and demands a better world for those who have been ignored for too long. The politics of rebellion. In the modern political landscape, Robin Hood has evolved into an archetype of resistance. His actions, the stealing from the wealthy and powerful to benefit the needy, are now echoed in movements pushing back against the growing divide between rich and poor. Whether through protests, activism, or the rise of anti-capitalist rhetoric, Robin Hood's figure stands as a beacon of defiance against unjust systems. When political leaders across the globe rise to power, their rhetoric often channels the same themes that Robin Hood embodied. The same anti-establishment fervor that drove his story forward is now adopted by many modern leaders, from the populists to the progressives. They talk of redistributing wealth, calling for policies that aim to curb the greed of the wealthy few while providing for the marginalized. The ideals that Robin Hood championed, equality, justice, and a sense of shared responsibility, have become central to modern political debates. In moments of social unrest, Robin Hood is often invoked, as people rally against perceived oppression. Activists and protesters adopt his story to give voice to their struggles, calling for wealth redistribution, social justice, and a more equitable society. The idea of fighting back against powerful elites, of daring to stand against systems that seem unchangeable, fuels movements from grassroots organizations to global campaigns. Modern Robin Hood figures. In the present day, politicians, social leaders, and revolutionaries who have used Robin Hood as a model for their actions are not few. They champion redistribution of wealth, fight for workers' rights, and demand that the rich pay their fair share of taxes. Some have even gone so far as to adopt Robin Hood's symbolism and rhetoric in their political campaigns. Figures such as Bernie Sanders, Jeremy Corbyn, and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez have brought forth policies that focus on economic fairness, providing the underprivileged with the resources to thrive while demanding that the wealthiest carry a heavier load. These political figures, like modern-day versions of Robin Hood, have aimed to correct what they perceive as gross inequalities in modern societies. But it's not just the left wing of politics that has drawn on Robin Hood's tale. Even in conservative politics, the figure of Robin Hood can be wielded to support the idea of tax justice and the protection of the middle class from an overbearing wealthy elite. In both scenarios, the myth of Robin Hood is used to draw clear lines between the powerful few and the marginalized many, creating a stark moral divide that fuels political discourse. Social movements and Robin Hood. Robin Hood's story resonates deeply in social justice movements, especially those that address issues like poverty, income inequality, and economic exploitation. The legend is often invoked in the fight against corporate greed, unfair taxation, and worker exploitation. Activists who champion environmental justice or human rights are frequently drawn to the figure of Robin Hood, using his story to advocate for reparations, debt forgiveness, and social welfare. For example, the Occupy Wall Street movement, which demanded that the wealthiest 1% of society pay their fair share and that the financial system be reformed to serve the common good, drew heavily from Robin Hood's story. Protesters marched through the streets, holding signs with slogans like "Tax the rich," "We are the 99%," and "Give to the poor." In these moments, Robin Hood was not a distant myth, but an active symbol of rebellion against the unfair distribution of wealth. The fight against climate change also channels Robin Hood's ideals. Activists, especially youth movements like Fridays for Future, frame their battle as one to protect the poor and the vulnerable from the environmental impact of the wealthy few. They argue that the richest countries and corporations are largely responsible for carbon emissions, yet it is the global poor who will face the greatest consequences. In this context, Robin Hood's image of taking from the wealthy elite and giving to the oppressed has become a potent symbol of moral righteousness and social responsibility. Robin Hood's symbol in pop culture. In an age dominated by social media and global connectivity, Robin Hood's symbol is as potent as ever. The narrative of robbing from the rich to give to the poor is easily packaged into a tweet, a hashtag, or a viral video. In a world where disparities in wealth and social injustice are starkly visible, Robin Hood's legend continues to fuel online campaigns, social movements, and even activism on the ground. Pop culture has embraced Robin Hood as well. From movies to TV shows, the outlaw hero is often portrayed as an icon of the underdog, a figure who dares to challenge those in power. Robin Hood's struggle against tyranny mirrors the struggle of modern-day protesters, activists, and social leaders who face the impossible odds of challenging powerful corporations, governments, and societal systems that perpetuate inequality. Robin Hood's presence in film and television has kept his ideals alive, keeping the flame of his story burning brightly in the hearts of the public. The enduring relevance. Ultimately, what makes the legend of Robin Hood so powerful today is its timeless relevance. As long as there are people suffering from injustice, feeling the weight of inequality, and witnessing the unbridled greed of the few, the story of Robin Hood will continue to inspire. His message of hope, resistance, and solidarity will continue to serve as a moral guide and a source of courage for those who dare to challenge the status quo. Whether through protests, political campaigns, or social movements, Robin Hood's legacy remains ever present, a reminder that the fight for justice is not just a battle for the past, but for the future as well. The idea of wealth redistribution carries with it a moral weight, a question of right and wrong that has reverberated through history and continues to stir debate today. At the heart of this ethical conversation is a seemingly simple but profoundly complex question: is it right to take from the wealthy to help those in need? This dilemma is as old as human society itself, and it traces its roots back to the very principles that govern fairness, justice, and the distribution of power in any community. As we look at this question today, through the lens of history, politics, and economics, we find ourselves navigating a web of conflicting beliefs, values, and systems. The figure of Robin Hood, the outlaw who famously robbed from the rich and gave to the poor, is often invoked as a symbol of moral justification for wealth redistribution. But when we step away from the legend, the question becomes more challenging. Is it truly ethical to forcibly take money from the rich, regardless of how unjust the system may be? This question becomes even more complicated when we start to explore the broader implications of wealth distribution, not just as a personal act of charity, but as a policy, one that could be forced on a whole society. The moral argument for wealth redistribution. For many, the moral argument for wealth redistribution is rooted in a deep-seated belief in social justice. In a world where disparities in wealth are stark, where a handful of individuals and corporations control vast amounts of resources, while millions of people live in poverty, the idea of redistributing wealth seems not only logical, but also humane. After all, why should a small group have so much, while so many others struggle for even the most basic of needs? Wealth redistribution, from this perspective, can be seen as a way to level the playing field, ensuring that those who have been born into disadvantaged circumstances or who have been denied opportunities due to systemic inequalities have a fighting chance at a decent life. The call for redistribution doesn't simply come from a place of envy or resentment, but from a desire to create a fairer society where everyone has access to the same opportunities and rights. The wealthy, in this argument, are often seen as having gained their fortunes not purely through merit or hard work, but by exploiting the system or benefiting from unfair advantages. In this light, Robin Hood is no mere criminal. He is a figure of resistance, a champion of the oppressed, fighting against a system that perpetuates exploitation and inequality. His actions, taking wealth from the rich and redistributing it to the poor, are seen as an act of moral courage, a direct challenge to the established order that allows the wealthy few to grow richer while the majority languish in poverty. The moral argument against wealth redistribution. However, not everyone sees wealth redistribution as a morally justifiable act. Those who argue against it often raise concerns about the rights of individuals and the role of the state. From this perspective, wealth is viewed as the fruits of one's labor, and taking someone's wealth without their consent is akin to theft, regardless of the greater good it might serve. Robin Hood's actions, in this light, are not noble, but criminal. He violates property rights, disregards the rule of law, and sets a dangerous precedent where the ends justify the means, which could easily be abused by others. Those who reject wealth redistribution often argue that charity and voluntary giving are the proper ways to address inequality. They believe that wealth should be redistributed through personal choice rather than state coercion. This belief is rooted in the idea that individual freedom and property rights are fundamental values in a society, and that the government should not have the power to confiscate wealth from citizens, no matter how unjust the distribution might seem. For many who hold this view, the idea of wealth redistribution is not just about economics, but about respecting personal autonomy and freedom. They argue that people should have the right to decide for themselves how their wealth is used, whether for personal consumption, charitable giving, or investment. Forcing individuals to part with their money through taxes or other mechanisms is seen as an infringement on their liberty and individual rights. The role of the state. The debate surrounding wealth redistribution also ties into the role of the state. Should the government be responsible for ensuring that wealth is distributed fairly? This is a key point of contention. Those in favor of redistribution argue that the state has a moral obligation to ensure that wealth is used to benefit society as a whole, not just the wealthy few. The argument here is that markets, left to their own devices, often fail to distribute resources equitably, and that only through government intervention can systemic inequalities be addressed. Those against it, however, contend that the government should not play such a role in economic affairs. They believe that individuals, not the state, should have the freedom to decide how wealth is distributed. The state's role, in their view, should be to maintain order, protect individual rights, and ensure that everyone has the freedom to pursue happiness without interference. A question of fairness. At its heart, the ethics of wealth redistribution come down to questions of fairness. Is it fair for a small group of people to control most of the wealth while others live in squalor? Is it fair for individuals to be born into extreme wealth while others are born into extreme poverty? Is it fair for some to inherit vast fortunes while others struggle to make ends meet? On the other hand, is it fair for a government to forcibly take someone's hard-earned wealth, regardless of how that wealth was accumulated? Is it fair to punish success, especially when the wealthy have worked hard to achieve their fortunes? Where do we draw the line between justified taxation for the common good and unjust confiscation of wealth for the benefit of others? The heart of the debate. As we wrestle with these questions, we are confronted with a deep ethical dilemma. On one side is the desire for a world where everyone has enough, where the poor have the opportunity to thrive and the oppressive forces of inequality are challenged. On the other side is the belief that individual rights must be respected, that no one should be forced to give away their wealth, regardless of the circumstances. In the end, the question of wealth redistribution is not just about economics or politics, it is about our shared humanity. It's about asking ourselves whether we are willing to sacrifice a little of our own wealth, power, or privilege for the greater good, and whether we are willing to stand up for those who have been left behind by society. Robin Hood's story, though centuries old, continues to force us to confront these uncomfortable, yet necessary, questions about the balance between justice and fairness, and the role of the state and the individual in shaping a just society. Sherwood Forest, the legendary home of Robin Hood and his merry men, has always held a special place in the hearts of those who love nature. Its dense trees, winding paths, and deep-rooted mystery have not only made it a backdrop for tales of rebellion and heroism, but also a symbol of the wild, untamed beauty of the natural world. Today, Sherwood Forest stands as more than just a place from a medieval legend. It has become a rallying point for modern environmental movements, representing the fight to preserve nature against the forces of urbanization, industrialization, and environmental degradation. In a world where forests are shrinking, wildlife habitats are disappearing, and pollution runs rampant, Sherwood Forest reminds us of a time when nature was still revered as a sanctuary, a source of life, and a place of freedom. The environmental message tied to Robin Hood and his legendary forest has grown stronger over time, resonating with movements that aim to protect the environment from those who exploit it for profit and personal gain. Robin Hood's forest was not just a hiding place for outlaws, it was a symbol of freedom, away from the oppressive constraints of the system. It was a place where those who had been wronged could find solace and strength, where the natural world was both a refuge and a source of empowerment. In this sense, the fight to protect Sherwood Forest mirrors modern battles to protect endangered ecosystems. Today, Sherwood is not just about the Robin Hood legend, it represents the wild, untamed parts of the world that people are fighting to preserve. As environmental concerns have grown, the destruction of forests, the loss of biodiversity, and the degradation of natural landscapes have become urgent issues. The metaphorical connection between Robin Hood's resistance to injustice and the global fight to protect the environment has become a powerful narrative. Just as Robin Hood challenged an unjust system that exploited the poor and powerless, environmental activists challenge a modern system that exploits the earth and its resources without regard for the long-term damage. Sherwood Forest and its real-life conservation efforts. Sherwood Forest, once sprawling over a vast expanse, has not been immune to the ravages of time. While the forest today may not be as wild and expansive as it was in the time of Robin Hood, it still stands as a beacon of what can be preserved through concerted efforts. Today, it is a protected national nature reserve, and significant efforts have been made to conserve its unique ecological systems. These conservation efforts are not just about protecting the trees, they are also about preserving the wildlife that depends on the forest for survival. The forest's ancient oak trees, some of which are over 1,000 years old, serve as living reminders of the importance of protecting old-growth ecosystems. These trees, like the legendary heroes of Robin Hood, have witnessed centuries of change and strife. They stand strong, rooted in the earth, symbolizing resilience and the enduring power of nature. The preservation of Sherwood today goes beyond the realm of folklore. It represents the ongoing struggle to preserve natural landscapes in the face of industrial and urban encroachment. The modern-day fight to save Sherwood Forest mirrors the global movement toward environmental justice. Just as Robin Hood fought for justice and equality, modern environmental movements fight for the preservation of the natural world for all people. They challenge the exploitation of natural resources, advocating for more sustainable practices that prioritize the health of the planet. In this way, Sherwood Forest has become a symbol of environmental resistance, a reminder that we must defend the earth, as Robin Hood defended the people of his time. Robin Hood and modern environmental heroes. In the same way that Robin Hood is considered an outlaw hero, modern environmental activists can be viewed as outlaws of the 21st century, challenging corporations and governments that profit from exploiting the planet. Whether it's fighting for the protection of the Amazon rainforest, opposing the destruction of the Great Barrier Reef, or challenging the rampant pollution that harms ecosystems worldwide, environmentalists are taking a stand, just as Robin Hood did. Today's environmental movements find their inspiration not only in the actions of real-world heroes, but also in the timeless values that Robin Hood represents: solidarity, resistance, and a deep love of nature. Activists are stepping into the shoes of Robin Hood's merry men, working together as a community to protect what they hold dear. They are armed with knowledge and technology rather than bows and arrows, but their mission remains the same: to protect the earth from those who would harm it. The Greenpeace movement, for example, often uses direct action to bring attention to environmental abuses, much like Robin Hood's band of outlaws. They stand up against deforestation, pollution, and overfishing, all of which threaten the delicate balance of the planet. These modern-day activists could be seen as guardians of the earth, working tirelessly to ensure that nature is not overrun by greed and profit. Robin Hood's story also touches on the importance of community in environmentalism. The merry men, diverse as they were, fought together for a common cause, and this spirit of collaboration is evident in today's environmental efforts. In many ways, environmental issues cannot be solved by one person alone. It takes a community effort to make lasting change. The community-based approach of protecting local ecosystems, mobilizing citizens, and advocating for policy changes is at the heart of environmentalism. The continuing relevance of the legend. The legend of Robin Hood continues to inspire because it represents a deep-seated yearning for justice, for the protection of those who cannot protect themselves, and for the defense of the natural world from exploitation. Just as Robin Hood fought against a system that oppressed the poor and helpless, modern-day environmentalists fight against a system that exploits the earth and its resources for the benefit of the few. As the global climate crisis intensifies, the urgency of protecting the environment becomes clearer. The call for sustainability and climate justice echoes the calls for social justice that have long been at the heart of the Robin Hood legend. Restoring balance, not only to society but also to the natural world, is a common cause for both. Sherwood Forest's enduring legacy as a place of rebellion and resilience serves as a reminder that nature is worth fighting for. The legend of Robin Hood, once confined to the pages of medieval tales, has taken on new meaning in the age of climate change, serving as an allegory for the ongoing fight to protect our environment. It's a battle that transcends the medieval past and moves firmly into the present, inspiring new generations to take up the bow and arrow, not to steal, but to protect the earth for future generations. There's something timeless about the story of Robin Hood, a character who has managed to remain etched in the hearts and minds of people around the world for centuries. Despite the passage of time, his image has endured and evolved, becoming a pop culture phenomenon that crosses boundaries, from medieval tales to blockbuster movies. So why does Robin Hood continue to be a beloved figure in global entertainment? What is it about this outlaw hero that keeps drawing people to him, generation after generation? Robin Hood represents an idealized vision of rebellion and justice, a man who defies authority in favor of the powerless. In a world that often feels controlled by the rich and powerful, Robin Hood's mission to steal from the rich and give to the poor resonates deeply. His story is not just about outlaw antics, it's about standing up to injustice, no matter the odds. This theme of resistance has remained relevant through every era, making Robin Hood a symbol of hope for the oppressed, a champion of the voiceless. Robin Hood and the spirit of rebellion. The enduring appeal of Robin Hood lies in his defiance of authority. In every age, societies have had their unfair systems, whether it was the Norman oppression in medieval England, the oppression of the working class during the Industrial Revolution, or the rise of corporate greed in the modern world. Robin Hood's rebellion against these systems is what makes him a timeless figure. Whether he's standing up to the sheriff or facing down greedy aristocrats, his message of resistance transcends any one period. Modern interpretations of Robin Hood often reflect this spirit of rebellion. In a time when many feel disillusioned by the systems that seem to protect the powerful, Robin Hood offers a fantasy of revolution. His ability to challenge the status quo and fight for those who are marginalized strikes a chord with many. Pop culture adaptations continue to explore this theme, whether it's a modern-day Robin Hood stealing from corrupt corporations or a gritty reimagining where the hero challenges the system in new ways. The essence of his rebellious spirit remains unchanged. The archetype of the heroic outlaw. At the heart of Robin Hood's lasting popularity is his status as an outlaw hero. The archetype of the rogue with a cause is one that continues to captivate audiences. Robin Hood may break the law, but he does so for a greater purpose, to correct an imbalance, to right wrongs, and to restore justice. This makes him a flawed but relatable hero, someone who challenges norms in the pursuit of a noble cause. In pop culture, this archetype has been explored in countless ways. Think of characters like Han Solo from Star Wars or Jack Sparrow from Pirates of the Caribbean. Both are charming, law-breaking figures who operate on their own terms. These characters, much like Robin Hood, are deeply human in their imperfections but are nonetheless driven by an undeniable moral compass. Robin Hood's sense of justice and his ability to balance his rebellion with compassion is what has helped keep him relevant in stories across different genres and mediums. The romance of the outlaw. There's a certain romance to the idea of living outside the law, of being an outlaw on the run, yet fighting for what's right. This romantic aspect of Robin Hood's legend has been a key driver in his popularity. His adventures, his time spent in the forest, his close-knit bond with his merry men, and his relationship with Maid Marian all add layers of intrigue and emotion to his story. Robin Hood represents freedom, not just in terms of political rebellion, but also in terms of a life unbound by the constraints of society. The way Hollywood has played with this image, turning Robin Hood into a swashbuckling hero with a heart of gold, speaks to the enduring appeal of this freedom-loving figure. Whether in books, films, or television shows, Robin Hood has been portrayed as both a charming rogue and a sincere champion of justice. This balance of adventure and humanity is what makes him such a captivating figure in pop culture, and it's one of the reasons his story keeps getting retold. The enduring legacy in film and television. Robin Hood's journey through the entertainment landscape is nothing short of extraordinary. Since the first adaptations of the legend in the silent film era, there have been countless takes on the character, each offering a new perspective, yet always keeping the core elements intact. From Errol Flynn's charismatic portrayal in the 1938 film The Adventures of Robin Hood, to Kevin Costner's more modern take in Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves, 1991, and the grittier, action-packed version in Robin Hood, 2010, starring Russell Crowe, Robin Hood has remained an iconic figure in Hollywood. Each adaptation reflects the values and concerns of its time, showing just how adaptable the legend is. In the 1930s, Robin Hood's defiance symbolized the fight against fascism and corporate control. In the 1990s, his focus on redistribution and fighting the greed of the rich resonated with audiences during a period of economic inequality. And in modern takes, such as the 2018 film starring Taron Egerton, Robin Hood is reimagined as a more action-oriented hero, appealing to contemporary audiences' tastes for high-octane drama and rebellion. But Robin Hood's story doesn't just thrive in the mainstream, it also has a vibrant presence in independent film, television, and comic books, where more niche and subversive interpretations can be explored. The legend's fluidity allows creators to tweak it to fit new genres and contexts, but the fundamental themes of justice, rebellion, and compassion always remain. Global appeal. Robin Hood's appeal is not confined to the English-speaking world. His story has become a universal symbol of resistance against oppressive regimes, making him a beloved character in cultures worldwide. Whether it's Robin des Bois in France, Robin Hood-inspired characters in Latin America, or adaptations in countries as far-reaching as Russia, India, and China, the core themes of Robin Hood's story, fighting for justice, defending the helpless, and reclaiming what's rightfully theirs, resonate on a global scale. As entertainment becomes more globalized, Robin Hood remains a universal hero, one whose story can be adapted to fit any culture or political context. The inclusivity of his character, his simple morality, and his defiance of unjust authority make him a figure whose story transcends borders. The future of Robin Hood. As long as injustice exists and the powerful continue to exploit the powerless, Robin Hood will remain a figure of enduring relevance. His story will continue to evolve, shape-shifting into new forms and new contexts, but always carrying the spirit of rebellion and justice. In an age of modern media, Robin Hood's legend continues to adapt. He may not be stealing from the rich and giving to the poor in Sherwood Forest anymore, but his message remains the same. Revolutionary, charismatic, and deeply human, Robin Hood has earned his place as a beloved figure in the hearts of people around the world, and there's no sign of that changing anytime soon. Robin Hood's legend has been told countless times, but one element remains constant: the delicate balance between his identity as a hero and an outlaw. This dual nature is at the heart of what makes his story so compelling, and it's what has allowed him to endure through the ages. In every retelling, from ancient ballads to modern movies, Robin Hood is portrayed as both a savior and a criminal, and it's this tension that makes his character so layered and fascinating. On one hand, Robin Hood is a hero, a symbol of justice who fights to right the wrongs of the world. He is the ultimate champion of the downtrodden and oppressed, a protector of the poor who dares to challenge the corrupt and greedy. He takes from the rich, not for his own gain, but to give to those who have nothing. His actions are driven by a moral compass that tells him it is better to risk his own safety than to let others suffer. He is the embodiment of the noble rebel, defying unjust authority with a sense of righteousness that has made him a hero to the common people. Yet, at the same time, Robin Hood is undeniably an outlaw. He operates outside the law, breaking the very rules that he is trying to defend. His acts of rebellion are rooted in criminality, and there is no denying that he is a wanted man. In many versions of the legend, Robin Hood is labeled as a criminal by the authorities, a threat to order and stability. His methods are violent, his tactics are often ruthless, and the very act of theft goes against the law he claims to uphold. It is a complicated dichotomy that asks the question, can a man who breaks the law ever truly be a hero? This tension between the hero and the outlaw is what drives Robin Hood's story forward. He cannot be fully one or the other, and it is this ambiguity that makes him so captivating. His actions, while noble, are often morally gray. He does not hesitate to steal from those who have more than enough, and his resistance to authority is more than just a fight against bad rulers. It is a challenge to the entire system of power that enables such inequality. But this is where the complexity of Robin Hood's character comes into play. Is he a hero fighting for justice, or is he simply an outlaw using violence and theft to create a world that reflects his own sense of right and wrong? In some versions of the tale, Robin Hood is portrayed with a level of romanticism that casts him purely as the noble hero, his crimes justified by the greater good they serve. He is a man who bends the rules for a cause that many would agree is just. This vision of Robin Hood speaks to the power of the human spirit to rise above oppression and fight back, no matter the cost. His band of merry men are not merely outlaws, they are brothers in arms, fighting for freedom and equality in a world that has stripped them of both. In these stories, Robin Hood's outlaw status is almost an afterthought, secondary to his image as the hero of the people. Yet in other versions, Robin Hood's status as an outlaw is not so easily overlooked. His rebellion against the sheriff of Nottingham and the ruling class often leads to bloodshed and destruction, and some versions of the tale depict him as a man willing to resort to any means necessary to achieve his goals. This portrayal makes Robin Hood's heroism more nuanced, questioning the ethics of using violence to accomplish a greater good. Can a man be a hero if he sacrifices his moral integrity in the process? The duality of Robin Hood's character is essential to understanding his enduring appeal. He is both a hero and an outlaw because those two roles are not mutually exclusive. His story speaks to the complexity of human nature, to the idea that sometimes the line between right and wrong is not always clear. In a world where the powerful often use the law to protect their own interests, Robin Hood's decision to break the law becomes an act of defiance against an unjust system. He is a man who is willing to take on the label of outlaw to bring about a better world, even if that means crossing moral boundaries. This dual nature also reflects the way in which society views rebellion and justice. Those in power often see Robin Hood as a dangerous criminal, someone who disrupts the order of things, while the common people view him as a savior, someone who is willing to make the ultimate sacrifice for their well-being. This clash of perspectives is not unique to Robin Hood. It is a theme that runs through history, where figures who challenge the status quo are often seen as criminals by those who benefit from the system, while being seen as heroes by those who suffer under it. As much as Robin Hood's actions can be debated, there is no denying that he is a symbol of resistance. His legend has persisted because it speaks to the power of defiance against oppression, even when that defiance is flawed or morally ambiguous. He is not a perfect hero, and that imperfection is what makes him relatable. We all struggle with questions of right and wrong, of justice and morality, and Robin Hood's story reminds us that the fight for what is right is rarely simple. Ultimately, the balance between Robin Hood's identity as a hero and an outlaw is what makes his story so enduring. It is a balance that resonates with the contradictions in the human spirit, the desire to do good, even when the path to that good is fraught with difficult choices. Robin Hood is a man who breaks the law for a higher purpose, who risks his life for the good of others, and who remains both a hero and an outlaw in the eyes of history. It is this dual nature that has made him a legend, one whose story will continue to be told as long as people fight for justice in a world that often seems unjust. The story of Robin Hood has stood the test of time, continuing to captivate audiences for centuries. In every retelling, from ballads sung in medieval taverns to blockbuster Hollywood films, the legend of this outlaw hero endures, drawing in new generations of fans. But what is it about Robin Hood that continues to resonate with people from all walks of life? What is it that makes his story timeless, so relevant, and so captivating, even in the modern age? The answer lies in the universality of the themes he embodies, the rebellion he represents, and the moral complexity of his character. At the core of Robin Hood's lasting appeal is his role as an underdog. People love to root for the underdog, the one who dares to challenge the powerful, the corrupt, and the oppressive. Robin Hood represents the ultimate underdog, an outlaw with nothing but his wits, his skill with a bow, and his sense of justice. He takes on the might of the Sheriff of Nottingham and the oppressive rulers of his time, not out of personal gain but out of a deep-seated desire to bring fairness to a broken world. In many ways, Robin Hood is not just fighting for himself, but for the powerless, for those who cannot fight for themselves. His story speaks to the human need for justice and fairness, a need that transcends time and culture. It taps into a universal yearning to see wrongs righted, and the little guy standing up against the powers that be. The rebel hero archetype that Robin Hood embodies is another reason why he has such lasting power. In a world where authority often seems unyielding and those in power can be easily corrupted, there is something deeply appealing about a character who refuses to accept the status quo. Robin Hood doesn't just passively accept the harsh conditions of his world, he actively rebels, using his skills and his intelligence to challenge the system. He is the embodiment of resistance, the man who refuses to bow to tyranny, and his actions spark something deep within us, the desire to fight back when we are pushed too far. His story gives voice to those who feel powerless, and shows that even the smallest person can make a difference when they stand up for what's right. Then, there is the moral complexity of Robin Hood's character that adds layers to his appeal. He is not a typical, one-dimensional hero. He is an outlaw, a criminal who breaks the law in order to do what he believes is right. This moral gray area makes Robin Hood a character that is not just admired but also debated. He is a figure that asks difficult questions about justice, authority, and the cost of rebellion. Does breaking the law make someone a criminal, or is it the cause they are fighting for that matters more? Can someone who is technically an outlaw still be a hero? These questions give Robin Hood depth, and it is this complexity that draws audiences and time again. We are fascinated by characters who are not easily categorized into good or bad. We want to know what drives them, what makes them tick, and what it means to be a hero in a world that is far from perfect. Moreover, Robin Hood's connection to brotherhood and community is another reason his legend resonates so deeply. His band of merry men is more than just a group of outlaws, they are a family. In a time of hardship, injustice, and oppression, Robin Hood and his men find solidarity in one another. They fight for a common cause, share in their triumphs and losses, and create a bond that is stronger than blood. This sense of belonging and loyalty is a powerful message that continues to inspire people. In today's world, where many feel isolated or alienated, Robin Hood's story reminds us of the power of unity and purpose. His merry men represent the idea that, together, people can stand against the odds and accomplish great things. It's a call to action, a reminder that we are not alone in our struggles, and that through friendship and shared ideals, we can overcome the forces that seek to divide us. Additionally, Robin Hood's relationship with nature adds to the timelessness of his story. Sherwood Forest, where Robin and his merry men hide, is more than just a setting, it is a symbol of freedom. The forest represents the wild, untamed world outside the control of corrupt rulers, a place where Robin can escape the reach of the law and create his own moral code. The idea of escaping to a place of sanctuary, where one is free to live outside the constraints of society, is a fantasy that appeals to many. In today's world, where people often feel trapped by rules, expectations, and societal pressures, the idea of retreating into nature and finding freedom, just as Robin Hood does, is an incredibly powerful and appealing image. Finally, Robin Hood's lasting appeal lies in his connection to the fight for justice. While his story may have been born in the medieval past, the issues he addresses are timeless. The fight for equality, fairness, and the rights of the oppressed continues to be relevant today, whether in the context of income inequality, political corruption, or social justice movements. Robin Hood is not just a figure of the past, he is a symbol of resistance against injustice, no matter the time or place. This connection to modern struggles is why Robin Hood continues to captivate audiences across the world. Whether through literature, film, or activism, the themes of the legend continue to echo in contemporary society, reminding us of the power of rebellion, the importance of standing up for what is right, and the unyielding belief that justice can prevail even against overwhelming odds. The story of Robin Hood endures because it taps into something deeply human, a desire for fairness, a need for justice, and a hunger for rebellion against oppressive forces. It speaks to the underdog within us all and shows that sometimes the greatest heroes are the ones who defy the rules for a cause greater than themselves. Robin Hood's legend will continue to inspire, not because he is a perfect hero, but because he is a hero who is not afraid to challenge the world around him. And in doing so, he shows us all that we too can make a difference. The legend of Robin Hood has endured for centuries because of its profound and complex exploration of justice. Robin Hood is often seen as the quintessential figure who questions the law, not for the sake of rebellion, but for the sake of righting wrongs in a world that is deeply flawed. His philosophy of justice is not merely about breaking the law, it is about challenging the systems that perpetuate inequality and demanding fairness for those who have been wronged. In today's world, where issues of social justice, equality, and fairness are at the forefront of public discourse, Robin Hood's actions resonate with many. But what does Robin Hood's philosophy truly teach us about justice, and how can we apply his ideas in the modern world? At the heart of Robin Hood's philosophy is the belief that justice should serve the people, not the powerful. He challenges the traditional view of law as something that upholds the interests of the elite and the rich, while disregarding the needs of the poor and downtrodden. In his world, the sheriff and the nobility are the ones with the power, and the law is an instrument to maintain their control. Robin Hood's rebellion is a response to this unjust system. He robs from the rich and gives to the poor, not because he despises the wealthy, but because he sees how systemic inequality is embedded in the structures of his society. The poor, in his eyes, are deserving of the same rights and resources that the rich enjoy, and his actions are a direct challenge to the idea that the rich deserve their wealth simply by virtue of their position. In today's world, Robin Hood's philosophy speaks to the ongoing struggles for equality and justice. We live in a time where the rich and powerful often hold the reins of the economy and politics, while the most vulnerable members of society continue to face discrimination, poverty, and exploitation. Robin Hood's message is clear: when a system benefits the few at the expense of the many, it is not justice, it is oppression. The modern world is full of examples where wealth and power are concentrated in the hands of a select few, leaving the majority to fend for themselves. Whether it's the rising wealth inequality, corrupt political systems, or a justice system that disproportionately affects marginalized communities, the message of Robin Hood is as relevant today as it was in medieval England. His story teaches us that true justice lies in dismantling systems that perpetuate inequality and in lifting up the voices of the oppressed. But Robin Hood's philosophy also teaches us something more subtle: the importance of moral courage. Robin Hood is not merely breaking the law for the sake of it, he is doing so because he believes that the law, in its current form, is unjust. In a world where standing up to the powerful often comes with great personal cost, Robin Hood's willingness to risk everything for what he believes is right is both inspiring and instructive. His actions remind us that sometimes justice requires us to take risks, to act against the prevailing systems, even when it feels like the odds are stacked against us. In today's world, activists, whistleblowers, and those who fight for social change often face great resistance, but like Robin Hood, they act because they believe that justice is worth the fight, even when it comes at a personal price. Moreover, Robin Hood's story challenges us to reconsider what justice actually means. Is it about punishing wrongdoers? Is it about revenge? Or is it about restoring balance and righting imbalances in society? In the case of Robin Hood, his acts of stealing from the rich are not motivated by a desire for wealth or revenge, but by a deep sense of moral duty to correct the systemic wrongs of his society. He takes from those who have too much and gives to those who have too little, seeking a more equitable balance. This is an important lesson for us in the modern world, where justice is often viewed through the lens of retribution and punishment. While holding individuals accountable for their actions is important, Robin Hood teaches us that justice is also about addressing the root causes of inequality and creating a society where everyone has an opportunity to thrive. In contemporary discussions around wealth redistribution and social justice, Robin Hood's actions raise important questions. What does it mean to be fair? Who gets to decide what is fair? The modern Robin Hood might not rob from the rich and give to the poor in the same way, but his philosophy challenges us to think about how wealth and resources are distributed and whether current systems of governance are truly serving the needs of all. Is justice about maintaining the status quo, or is it about upsetting the systems that perpetuate injustice? Is it about preserving the rights of the wealthy and powerful, or is it about creating a system where all people can live with dignity? Robin Hood also highlights the importance of solidarity and community. The merry men, who fight alongside Robin Hood, are not mere followers, they are equals in their mission, each contributing to the greater good. In today's world, this sense of community and collective action is just as vital as it was in Robin Hood's time. In a world that often celebrates individualism and competition, Robin Hood reminds us that justice is not a solitary pursuit. It requires collaboration, unity, and a shared commitment to creating a better world for everyone. Whether it's through grassroots movements, activism, or collective action, Robin Hood's message teaches us that solidarity is a key ingredient in achieving lasting social change. In the end, Robin Hood's philosophy challenges us to think critically about the justice systems in place today. His story teaches us that justice is not simply about laws or rules, it is about fairness, equality, and ensuring that every person, regardless of their status or wealth, has the opportunity to live a life of dignity and respect. Robin Hood's legacy is a reminder that justice requires us to question the systems we live in, to stand up for the oppressed, and to challenge the structures that perpetuate inequality. And while we may not take to the forest with a bow and arrow like Robin, his story encourages us to be brave, to be bold, and to never stop fighting for a more just world. The legend of Robin Hood has captivated people for centuries, but despite its enduring popularity, there are still numerous unanswered questions surrounding the tale. Many aspects of Robin Hood's life and deeds remain shrouded in mystery, adding layers of intrigue to a story that continues to evolve with each retelling. Some of these mysteries are rooted in historical uncertainties, while others have been shaped by the passage of time and the countless interpretations of the legend. Let's explore the unresolved questions that continue to linger over this legendary figure. Who was Robin Hood? One of the most basic and persistent mysteries surrounding Robin Hood is his true identity. For centuries, historians and scholars have debated whether Robin Hood was a real person or merely a figure of folklore. Some believe that Robin Hood was a composite of multiple individuals, each representing a different aspect of the outlaw archetype. Others suggest that the figure is based on a single historical person, but the question remains, who was he? Some have speculated that he may have been a disgruntled nobleman or a former soldier who took to the forest to rebel against an unjust system. Others propose that he could have been a common man, a yeoman or a serf, fighting to survive under oppressive rule. Yet, no definitive evidence has emerged to confirm his identity, leaving us with only fragments of his true nature. Was he a nobleman like some stories suggest, or was he just an ordinary man fighting for his people? Was Robin Hood a product of his time, or was he ahead of it? Another unresolved question revolves around Robin Hood's actions and motivations. His actions, particularly his desire to steal from the rich and give to the poor, are often viewed as a form of social rebellion against the powerful elite. But was Robin Hood a man of his time, driven solely by the injustices of medieval England, or did he possess a more progressive outlook? His actions appear to challenge the prevailing social and political order, yet his Robin Hood persona often seems timeless, appealing to people across different eras. Was his rebellion merely a response to the corruption of the time, or did he embody a more universal desire for social justice that transcends his historical period? The legend raises the question of whether Robin Hood was truly an outlaw of his age, or if his ideals of fairness and equality were far ahead of their time. The Sheriff of Nottingham, villain or victim? A key antagonist in the Robin Hood legend is the Sheriff of Nottingham, who is often portrayed as the villain standing in opposition to Robin and his merry men. However, the sheriff's role in the tale has been subject to much interpretation. Was he really the embodiment of evil, or was he simply a product of his position, a man tasked with enforcing the law during a time of great social unrest? Could the Sheriff of Nottingham have been a misunderstood figure, driven by the very system that Robin Hood sought to dismantle? While the legend paints the sheriff as a ruthless enforcer, history offers little concrete evidence of his personal actions, and some versions of the story suggest that he may have been more complex than simply a villain. Did he have a noble goal in mind, or was he just another pawn in the game of power? What happened to Robin Hood? As with many legendary figures, there is a mystery surrounding Robin Hood's fate. The tales vary on how his story concludes. Some versions suggest that Robin Hood lived to an old age, retiring from his outlaw life after finally defeating the Sheriff of Nottingham and making peace with the authorities. Others tell a more tragic end. Robin Hood is mortally wounded in an ambush by the sheriff's men, leading to his death in the arms of Maid Marian or one of his merry men. In some versions of the story, Robin Hood dies betrayed by one of his own, a dark twist in the tale of a man who was once a symbol of justice and fairness. Was Robin Hood's final demise a result of his own heroism, or was it the consequence of betrayal and treachery? The varying accounts leave us wondering what truly happened to him, and if his death was ever truly avenged. Was Maid Marian really his lover? Maid Marian is an integral part of the Robin Hood legend, often depicted as his romantic interest or his wife. However, the historical accuracy of their relationship has been questioned. In earlier versions of the story, Maid Marian is not mentioned at all, and her character is only later incorporated into the tale as a symbol of Robin Hood's love interest. Some historians have speculated that Maid Marian was a later addition to the story, created to romanticize Robin Hood's legend. But whether she was a historical figure or a fictional creation remains unknown. Was Maid Marian truly in love with Robin Hood, or was her role in the legend an invention by storytellers seeking to add romance to an otherwise gritty tale of rebellion? The ambiguity surrounding her character is one of the many unresolved mysteries of the Robin Hood legend. The influence of the Crusades on the Robin Hood legend. The connection between Robin Hood and the Crusades is another open question. Some versions of the Robin Hood story suggest that Robin may have fought in the Crusades before returning to England and becoming an outlaw. This connection raises intriguing questions about Robin Hood's military background and motivations. Did the Crusades shape his worldview and inspire his fight against authority? Was Robin Hood's rebellion fueled by a desire for justice after witnessing the brutalities of war, or was it merely a reflection of the social unrest of the time? The Crusades were a transformative event in medieval Europe, and their influence on Robin Hood's story remains unclear. Was Robin Hood's rebellion in some way a response to the horrors he witnessed during the Crusades, or is this connection simply a later embellishment of the tale? Is there any truth to the historical basis of Sherwood Forest? Sherwood Forest, the legendary home of Robin Hood and his merry men, has long been associated with the outlaw's adventures. However, its historical connection to Robin Hood remains elusive. While the forest itself is real, there is no solid evidence that Robin Hood ever lived or operated within its bounds. Some historians have suggested that Sherwood Forest became symbolic of Robin Hood's rebellion rather than a literal location. Was Sherwood Forest merely a setting for the legend, or was it an actual place that was part of Robin Hood's life? And if it was a real location, how did it become so deeply tied to the legend of Robin Hood? The legend of Robin Hood is filled with questions that remain unanswered, and perhaps this is part of what makes his stories so enduring. The unanswered mysteries fuel the imagination, allowing for endless interpretations and retellings. As long as these questions remain, the legend of Robin Hood will continue to captivate us, offering a story that evolves and adapts with each new generation. Perhaps it is the very uncertainty of Robin Hood's identity, fate, and motivations that allows his legend to live on, inspiring countless variations and interpretations across cultures and time periods. In the end, the questions about Robin Hood may be as important as the answers, reminding us that sometimes the mystery itself is what makes a legend truly unforgettable. The legend of Robin Hood occupies a fascinating space where history and mythology intertwine. At its core, the tale reflects universal themes of justice, rebellion, and the struggle for fairness in an unjust world. Yet, the true identity of Robin Hood, the specifics of his deeds, and the precise details of his life remain elusive. This combination of history and myth is what keeps the legend alive, adapting and morphing to fit the needs and desires of each generation. Robin Hood is not confined to a single moment in time or a particular set of facts. Instead, his story exists in a fluid, ever-changing space between fact and fiction. The blending of history and myth in Robin Hood's story creates a sense of timelessness. While historical records may offer fragments of a man or movement that may have inspired the legend, those records are incomplete and often contradictory. The myth, however, is what fills in the gaps, weaving together the larger-than-life deeds, the noble aspirations, and the enduring moral themes that define Robin Hood's character. In this way, Robin Hood becomes more than a historical figure. He becomes an idea, a symbol of resistance against tyranny and injustice. As a mythic figure, Robin Hood transcends the limitations of time and place. His story speaks to the collective consciousness, resonating with people in different eras and cultures. From medieval outlaws to modern rebels, Robin Hood's myth has adapted to fit the political, social, and cultural landscapes of the times. The Robin Hood legend continues to evolve, shifting from a tale of medieval English rebellion to a broader commentary on the human condition. In many ways, Robin Hood's place in history and myth is a reflection of our own struggles and desires. His outlaw status challenges authority, questions social order, and seeks to create a world where justice prevails over oppression. But as a mythical figure, he also represents the hope that one person, one act of rebellion, can change the course of history. The blending of these two aspects, history and myth, allows Robin Hood to remain a timeless symbol of hope, defiance, and the potential for a better world. At its heart, the Robin Hood legend is a reminder that history is never just a collection of facts and dates. History is shaped by the stories we tell, the myths we create, and the values we hold dear. Robin Hood's place in history and myth is not just about what happened in the past, but about how that past has been interpreted, celebrated, and kept alive through storytelling. In this way, the legend of Robin Hood continues to speak to us, offering a blend of history, myth, and meaning that resonates across time and space, inspiring generations to come.